Today's stream is about to start. We'll talk about code or whatever we'll talk about today. It's about to start, so please hang tight while I check that everything is okay. Sound check, camera check, lights check. How's my hair? Oh, wait, I don't have any hair. Maybe put some pants on and I am good to go. So get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start. Get ready wherever you are, 'cause this stream is about to start.
Hello, how's it going, everybody? Sorry we're a bit late. We were just testing some things, but we got a very special stream for you today. On my right, no, on this side, we got Darren Smudge from Mastering in the Box with us. Hi, how you doing, Darren?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you two?
We're good, and below me I got Leandro. How are you, Leandro?
Hello, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Leandro runs the show, you know, so we really appreciate him being here. Today we're going to talk about mastering, because we got a mastering specialist in the house. And Darren, a long time ago, mastered one of my songs, and we're going to make a video about it, but we're both busy. Darren just had a baby, so he's very, very busy. So we thought just knock the whole thing out in a live stream, no editing, bish, bash, bosh, Bob's your uncle. So that's what we're doing today.
Yeah, fantastic. And this is where you all get to see a true Reaper novice in action.
You use, I guess that's a good segue into the first question I had for you, which is you use Studio One and Reaper. So Is there a particular reason, like, do you prefer one for some things to the other? Like,
Yeah, kind of, yeah. I mean, there's Studio One is good for some things, but I don't want to say it's quite limited in certain. It is certain aspects. It is quite limited in. So, for example, if you was to use Reaper, everything's all done in the same page. So you can literally do everything. Whatever you need to do, you can do your advanced editing. You can do your automation. Even if you come to your sequencing, you can do your metadata, things like that. Studio One's slightly different in the fact that you have what they call a song page and a project page. So the song page is very much set up like a traditional Reaper page, and then you have a project page which is very much aimed towards mastering. But there's still some kind of shortfalls with Studio One in terms of the project page, in terms of things like take effects and things like that. They call them event effects. You can't apply those inside of Studio One, inside of the project page, and it's then kind of swapping between the two. So I'm finding certainly for a lot more of the advanced stuff, I find Reaper probably a bit more flexible in that respect. There's been a couple of times I was doing a classical piece a little while ago, and it was a Tchaikovsky cover, and I noticed that there was a bit of clipping from the right channel, so it was really difficult to kind of split the stereo file inside of Studio One, whereas Reaper just made it so easy. So there's things like that where you can start to split the files, process different bits independently. So
Cool. Also, I guess just for people who may not know about your channel, do you want to talk a little bit about what you do on there?
Yeah, I mean, great. So we've got a channel called Mastering in the Box, and it's very much, as it says in the name, it's all about digital mastering and digital audio. So the whole focus is very much along this kind of lines of, you don't have to have these massive, great big analog rigs. You don't have to spend thousands of pounds and all these different outboard units. You can get great results in the box. So that's very much kind of the whole ethos around it, and teaching people how to master different music in the box. There's a lot of Studio One related information on there, but there's also a lot of information that is cross-door compatible, because that was one of the big things for me, is I didn't want to make it entirely about Studio One. So there's lots of things in there around techniques you can use in any single DAW, and there are some bits in there where I've used Reaper for certain tutorials, and then there'll probably be much more Reaper stuff coming up very soon as well. So
cool, sounds like fun.
I think it's probably quite a good interesting point to add. One of the things I've noticed with it, there's a lot of different techniques in there covering some more of the simple techniques and some of the more advanced techniques, but one of the things I really want to focus on is actually doing almost a bit like a 101 type course as well coming soon. So that's going to be really hopefully that's going to be interesting for those who are very new to mastering and just want to kind of get into the basics of it and kind of expand their horizons from there, really.
Have you always worked in the box, or did you start with those big pieces of hardware that you talked about?
Pretty much exclusively in the box. I've had a few select units, but it's kind of been one of those things where I've always wanted a minimal setup. So the studio for me is I work from home, so this is my own studio, and it's it's very much kind of I'm thinking about where do I put the money basically. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of acoustic treatment I've been doing recently, and I'm really focused on the monitoring setup. So that really for me is the big key over some real kind of high end mastering gear. And there is a big trend now in the mastering industry where the whole attitude towards analog versus digital is now it's not really becoming it's not a competition anymore. And I think a lot of the high-end mastering engineers now seeing actually you can get great results with both. Some will have certain use cases, but it's not kind of one or the other. You can get some great results either with digital or with analog. It just depends on workflow, really.
I guess talk to us about some of your acoustic treatment too. I see you got some bass traps kind of in the corner there. Did you make those or did you buy them?
Some and some. So the two cream ones you can see here and here, they're actually from GIK, and that's a corner bass trap, and this is kind of one of their new units. It's actually you can see it's segmented, and these are. I'm trying to think how to describe them, but they're actually modular. So they actually slide off and slide in. So you can basically have them as individual units, or you can have them as I've got them to cover, because I've got a double window there. So that was bought purely to cover the window. So you can buy those as however as you see fit. But I've been really impressed with the GIK stuff. But most of the stuff is actually self-made. So I just started simply with simple things like first reflection points, so covering the right-hand side, left-hand side and the ceiling, and then got some treatment on the back. And then as I'm going through, I'm starting to add more and more treatment as and where it's needed. But it's a long and involved process. It's not a case of just getting some panels and sticking them up on the wall. It's basically you get some panels, get them up, measure the room, then you've got to kind of think about where your the downsides of the room are. Then you can kind of start to fabricate the room as you need rather than just adding up a load of panels. So it's very involved. It's way over my head at times, which is why I started to go through GIK. But nice. It's good fun. It is good fun, and it's nice and technical, but there is parts of it where it does go a little bit over my head.
When you say measure the room, do you mean like getting a measuring tape to find the places where you want to put the treatment, or are you talking about measuring measurement microphones? Oh, I see.
Yeah. So like you was using the other day, because I saw your stream when you was doing the microphone.
Oh yeah.
He was using the Room EQ Wizard. So that is a fundamental tool used in acoustic treatment or acoustics, measuring acoustics. So it's basically using a bona fide measurement microphone, and then you have to effectively set the microphone up in certain places throughout the room, especially situated around the listening position, and then you'll get the signal coming out of the speakers, and it will start to measure the frequency of your room and tell you measure the frequency of your room rather than anything else. So that's effectively what we talk about in terms of measuring the room from an acoustics perspective.
Cool.
So, yeah, it's this room is like a lot of people who kind of who have their own studios and things like that. You never get a good room in terms of no room is going to be perfect. Mine is probably a little bit more unique in the fact that I've got some open doorways and things like that. I have to kind of counteract with some heavy curtaining and stuff like that. But it's great fun, and it's one of those things that over time just keep adding to it. And I see that Mike's. Have you seen Mike's with his drum room? I don't know if he's watching, if he's in the chat, but I know he's just done his videos, hasn't he, about his homemade acoustic panels as well. So that was certainly a good watch.
Yeah, I haven't watched the video yet, but I saw the thumbnail. It's my only day off, like in 10 days or something. But yeah, I'm gonna check that out. Mike is, of course, for anybody who doesn't know, runs the channel Let's Talk About Reaper. Great channel. You should subscribe to Mastering in the Box, subscribe to Leandro Facchinetti, all those things you should be doing. New Morning Records ask, what's your favorite plugin for mastering? Which I guess is a broad question, but yeah, let's talk some plugins.
Yeah, favorite plugin. I'll tell you what, this is a bit of a strange one, but this was a recommendation through the Reaper Discord group, and someone suggested using Splice EQ from Kilohertz.
Okay.
It's turned into one of my favourites, and I'll tell you why. Because you can do normal EQ, but you can also do mid-side all in the same window. So a lot of these type of plugins, you can do stereo EQ, or you can do mid-side EQ, but you can't do them all at the same time. Whereas that Slice EQ is fantastic, because not only can you do both inside of the same plugin GUI, it color codes everything. So you can see how you're processing the mono frequencies, how you're doing a stereo, and you can do all sorts. It's so easy to use. So that, for me, has become one of my favourites. It really has. I think apart from that, I suppose probably the Stealth Limiter by IK Multimedia. Limiters they're strange beasts. Some can be more, let's say, aggressive than others. I find the Stealth Limiter, that's something that pretty much use on every master, because for me, it just gives me, I don't want to say the most transparent results, but it's probably the more, or the least taxing on the actual source material itself. So if I need to push, say, 3 or 4 dBs worth of gain into that plugin, I know that it's not going to start crashing the life out of the overall mix or out of the master. So that, for me, is probably another go-to. Outside of that, I don't have a chain, and this is probably one of my, I don't want to say one of mine necessarily, it's not necessarily a bugbear, but when I see people saying, well, what's your mastering chain, when they're talking about in the box, and my whole ethos is, well, you shouldn't really have one. You should have kind of a structure you kind of work to, but if you're using the same plugins in kind of a chain format, you shouldn't really know what you want to do until you start to listen to the material itself. So, I do try and change it up a little bit. I do have some more select pieces that I use. Some of the plugin alliance things, for example, do use quite a few of the IK Multimedia plugins. TDR stuff, the Tokyo Dawn Lab stuff, I think are great. Even some of the Reaper stuff. Some of the Reaper plugins are fantastic for different bits. I went for a time when I needed to get a new multi-band compressor. I'm trying to think what I was using beforehand, but I started to use the X-Comp, which I've got some great results with that. So there's so many different plugins out there that you can use. You don't always have to spend a load of money, but if I was to choose a few favourites, I'd probably say I'm sure it's the Slice EQ and the Stealth Limiter by IK.
Nice. Raphael is asking what your approaches or strategies are for mastering surround or ambisonic. Do you dabble in that stuff?
No, not at the moment. Not at the moment, because it's something that I will likely invest in. But once again, it's kind of trying to think of the best solution, because at the moment I'm in quite a small room, and to have something like that, you need to have not only what we're looking at, what's the traditional at the moment for, if you think about Dolby, what is it, 714 systems, 716 systems maybe, 714 I think is kind of the standard now. So you're looking at a sub plus effectively 11 other speakers. So it's something that I can't accommodate at the moment. I may start to look into something like this further down the line in terms of headphones. Now this is quite an interesting one, and it's something I kind of dabble with at the beginning of this year. And I don't really like mastering with headphones, but something I may look into that some point down the line for some of the more spatial audio or Dolby Atmos type things some point down the line. But it's not really something I dabble too much in at this moment.
Yeah, I think same here. Like you need a good space or access to a good space. So pre-COVID, like I had access to where I went to school, the Vancouver Film School, and I could go there and like do surround work. It's all set up, but like in any house, it just feels like a massive expense. And I mean, I'm renting, so I'm never gonna do that to a house that I'm not owning. You know.
And are you interested in dabbling
Yeah.
with this just out of curiosity, or is it something that clients are asking for?
I've not had an approach yet for a client who wants to do something like spatial or Dolby, but it is becoming it's becoming much more popular now. At the moment, it's very much aimed more towards the high end artists more than I predominantly focus more with independent artists. But I've not had an approach yet, but I'm sure there will get times when it will come. The other thing as well is you've got to be very. It's not just a case of just having a setup. You've got to really. It's almost kind of you've got to go through a tick box exercise just to be approved, and that's one of the things is to go through I think it's the Apple Music. You have to go through an approval process to be an approved engineer, and you have to use. I don't want to say certain monitoring setup, but the speakers have to be kind of all of the same make. They have to be of a certain quality, etc. Before you can, before you get kind of your name ticks and things like that onto as a dedicated Dolby Atmos engineer. But it's, I just think it's fascinating the way that the audio is going. I know a lot of people have had some, I would say, negativity towards it. I think it will become much more popular maybe over the next 5 to 10 years. It'll be interesting. I do think that the uptake from a lot of the engineering community has been big. I didn't think it would be. Certainly when it was first kind of on the scene, there was a lot of people saying, no, I'm not interested. Those people now, somewhat 2 years later, are getting Dolby Atmos set up. So to me, it kind of is very suggestive that it is something that's here to stay.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really fun. It's also kind of an opportunity because we're obviously in an era where stereo music is very available and people want to pay, $5 a month and get unlimited access to all their music. So maybe it'll get to a point where that could become a new stream of income for musicians because you may not have a nice like Atmos system at home. You go to a place and you listen to an album, right? And that could be an event, and people are more willing to kind of pay for that kind of experience versus, I understand why nobody wants to pay more than $5 a month for music because they can just pay $5.
Yeah, but it's interesting to me is if you look at a lot of because the way there's this whole big thing in the industry now, and I know that the Audio Engineers Society is looking quite in depth at the playback systems or the playback systems that a lot of the listeners are using. And I know there's a real big drive to kind of improve the quality of the technology over time. But if you look at things like laptops now and even sound bars, they're all advertised as spatial audio compatible. But yet it's like a lot of it's like a mono speaker. If it's stereo, think of a laptop. You've got two small speakers, generally underneath the laptop. How's that spatial?
Yeah,
I don't know how they can advertise it, but there's a lot of companies out there advertising certain listening systems as spatial, but you're not going to listen to anything behind you, right? You're not going to have anything coming behind you when you're looking at two speakers on a laptop. So yeah, there's going to be it's certainly going to be. It's becoming more popular for people to advertise technology as spatial, but I don't think it's not there yet. So like you say, it'll be interesting to see if you get these venues specifically set up with these spatial audio setups.
Would be fun. Somebody's asking best tape emulation plugin. I guess, do you use them? And yeah, if you do, what do you use?
Yep, I'm going to show you in a second. It's the Tape Machine 440 by IK Multimedia. Now, it's quite an interesting one, this, because my thought process with this is, I'm not from an era. As much as I may look like an old fart, I'm still only 39. So I can't, I'm not going to say that I'm from an area where I know that loads about tape machines. So, for me, I look at some of these tape machines and I just want something like almost like a one and done solution. And one of the things about this, the Tape Machine 440, is I looked. It's the only plugin I actually use a preset for, and there's a fantastic preset, and I think it comes up something like. I think it is literally just it's a 440 finish. Is the preset, and it's amazing. And I just use that preset just to kind of give it a little bit of edge. One of the things I notice more often than not is when you master for some of the more independent artists, you'll find that with the mixes, you'll find it's top heavy and bottom heavy, and the mid range you almost get kind of a little bit of that smiley face kind of curve. So one of the things by using this particular tape machine and this preset is the fact that it kind of gives some more of that mid range back without kind of over boosting the highs and the lows, and that's one of the things I love about it. So it's the T-Rex Tape Machine 440. It's pretty much the only one I use. I have got a few others that I've kind of dabbled with, the Baby Audio tape, and there's a Keve Audio one I've got that I want to do a look at and do a full review of. But that's pretty much, that one is my go-to. So if I want to get some kind of tape emulation on there, that will be the one I use.
Nice. So just so everybody knows, in a minute we're gonna look at a mix that I did and that Darren mastered. But I always ask this when I meet a mastering engineer, like what is kind of a mix that as a mastering engineer you receive and you go like, mwah, like this is how I want it. And what are some things that people do where you get it and you're like, now I gotta ask for something back, like ask for a revision, or just I can't work with this? Like, what are some of those things?
Yeah, I mean, the classic ones that you don't like is when you're clipping, and I've had it before, is when you're literally getting the WAV file sent through, and it's clipping before you've even done anything with it. And you can't, you can stick a limiter on, but even if you stick a limiter on, what's that going to achieve? Say it's 3 dBs over. If I need to set a limiter with a -1 dB ceiling, before I've even done anything, I know I've got 4 dBs worth of gain reduction on that limiter. It's still a clip signal, but just to make sure it's not clipping further, it's like you've got 4 dBs worth of compression. There's nothing I can do with that. So things like that are just a big no-nos. But it's, I mean, in the main, I've not really had any kind of like nightmare cases as such. I mean, this particular song here is kind of the kind of track that I like, because it's you can listen to it. It's already mixed great, it's performed great, and it's got a lot of dynamic content as well as a lot of energy. But it's more about how can you enhance it rather than trying to fix it. And that's the thing, is that's really what the engineers like, is thinking, okay, you've got a good mix now, what can you do to kind of enhance it, just take it that an extra a couple of percent, rather than, oh Christ, I'm going to have to do this to kind of fix this issue, or, trying to fix these issues. So these particular songs like these are the ones that we really like. Headroom's always got this big thing about, you have to leave 6 dBs worth of headroom. You don't have to leave 6 dBs worth of headroom. That was something that was kind of its legacy from the more analog days. The thing is, if you get a master it's got 6 dBs worth of headroom, as a master engineer, I've got to then think about, okay, well, what do I do with that to start with? I don't really want to chuck a limiter on straight away and start boosting gain. So normally when I get something that's got a load of headroom, I will normally normalize the track to say -1 or -2 dB, maybe even -3, just so there's a couple of dBs there before it even goes into the limiter. So, it's kind of getting that balance. You don't want it clipping, but don't leave too much headroom. Nice balance. Around about -3 should be more than ample. Give the master engineer a couple of dBs to work with. It's that kind of thing. Yes, you can clip gain it up, but for me, it's just a bit of an unnecessary step to leave, too much headroom, and then the engineer's just going to turn it up anyway. So that's something there to discuss. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much covered those main things. It's the clipping that's the big thing that really is the bugbear, because there's nothing you can do with it, and it has to go back.
Right, and as long as you don't clip, I guess, like you were saying, like if you leave 6 dB, we can normalize. If you leave 0.3 dB, and we just normalize down, like to get to kind of your starting point, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's once again, as long as it's not going into the red, basically, -0.3 is fine. I mean, this is where there's so many different techniques that you can do things. And it's like one of the things that we were speaking about in one of the forums a while ago in terms of mastering is some people use the final limiter, for example. So when it comes to digital mastering and releasing to the digital streaming platforms, there's a big thing in the industry about leaving 1 dB's worth of headroom. So there's going to be no clipping added after the fact when it's uploaded to the streaming platforms. Now, how you get there can be different ways of doing it. So, for example, you can use a limiter with a ceiling of -1 dB. Some people, though, don't like to do that. Some people might actually just use a ceiling, say, -0.1 and -0.3, and then just reduce the overall volume down once it's rendered. So you know that you're still going to have that little bit of a headroom there afterwards, but you're not pushing too much into the limiter. I mean, for me, 0.7 dBs, I don't look to smash the limiter anyway. So for me, I don't feel the benefit of doing that. But it's just another technique that some people use. And I think this is the thing, is there's no real one correct techniques. There's so many different ways of doing it. It's a bit like any engineering, but it's about using your creative, your creative mind as well. So, there's so many different ways to look at mastering.
New Morning Records is asking a question that actually reminded me I forgot to do something for today. Because when we were going to do a video, I was thinking of taking your master and then doing like a AI master and then having people like compare them and then see if they can tell which is which, like what they print, kind of a blind test, as it were. But I totally forgot to do that. But yeah, what do you think about kind of AI plugins and Lander and things like that?
Yeah, I don't know what to think of it, to be quite frank. I mean, there's obviously the negative aspect being a master engineer, and I look at some of the quality of the products that are being put out there from those services. I'm certainly not, I look at them and think, yeah, I'm not a fan in that respect. But there's obviously going to be a time and a place for them, and I think this is the thing. Part of my ethos around mastering the box, though, is trying to give people the skills that they can start to master themselves rather than relying overly on these types of services. Because, I can understand the whole ethos behind it. There's a lot of algorithms behind it. There's a lot of analysis done on past release music, and that's what they're effectively using. They're using the past release music to build these algorithms to then look at your master and master it based on a preset, effectively. So you choose the preset. It's going to do the work behind the scenes based on what's released so far, which is, it's commendable. But I suppose the whole thing for me about music is the fact that we're trying to create new sounds. So this is the thing for me I don't like about it is when you're trying to be new and creative, I don't want to be thinking too much about the past and what else has been released. It's a fresh sound. It's a fresh take on something. It needs to have that fresh perspective. So, I'm not a big fan particularly of the AI stuff, if I'm perfectly honest. I can see it fits a need, but it's not really something that I really look at. Even with the Ozone, and I'm going to show you some bits on Ozone in a second. They've got the mastering assistant. I won't use it. I don't like using it, even as a starting point, because for me it's very much a case of before I've done anything, I'm making a clear plan of what I want to do. So, I'm not going to rely on some kind of AI to put me in a ballpark, because it's unlikely to be what I'm thinking anyway. But there is a market for it, of course.
One thing, I think me and Leandro spoke about this at one point. One thing I like to do with Ozone is kind of to check my work with it. So I do a mix and then I put it through the master assistant. And, and if it's suggesting like 0.5 dB of boost around the, 200 region, I'm like, okay, I did a good mix. But if it's suddenly like take, 12 dB off of a certain region, then I know that I probably did a mix that's very unbalanced and my ears are too tired to kind of notice. So it's good that it can like serve as like an objective thing for you to kind of check your work against. But yeah, like obviously if it's suggesting a 12 dB cut, you shouldn't then just be like, okay, well the cut took care of it, let's move on. You got to go back and figure out like why. Yeah,
and like I say, I think these certain things they can have their place, and it's certainly that for me would be it's certainly a beneficial way to use it. But I suppose once again it goes back to that whole piece of it's your craft, your art, your sound, and it's down to I kind of get what you're saying, and I think it could be a good tactic to use, but still don't lose sight of the fact that it's your sound that you want. Reference on different systems. Make sure you're listening to it on headphones, on speakers, on your mobile phone, whatever. Use lots of different referencing tools. And see what it sounds like on different systems. But if you want a load of extra bass on there, then do it. Don't worry about Ozone mastering assistant saying, "Oh, it's too much" or "It's not enough" and stuff like that. Just use your own creative mind with that.
Speaking of creating your own sound, how do you relate to reference tracks? Do you use them at all? Do you try to mimic what you hear, or do you just use them to calibrate speakers, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it is a great question, and it's some and some. So as part of the process when you're mastering something for a client, it's trying to understand the sound. So it's trying to understand, things like, who were you inspired by? What was your inspiration when making this particular song? And then going from there. So if you've got a clear idea as to who they were referencing when they was coming up with the ideas in the first place, well, that kind of gives you a good idea from the referencing perspective. But once again, it's understanding that overall sound that the client is looking for. So you can say, well, we've kind of got in the style of such and such an artist, but we don't want it to be too pumped in the low end, or we don't want it too area at the top end, that kind of thing, or we want a little bit more balanced over the mid-range. And it's those kind of things. So referencing can get you somewhere. It certainly can, and it can be useful, but I don't use it as a general rule of thumb on every single project, especially with something like, we're looking at the Kurdistan Waltz, because of the type of track that it is. There's not a great deal of references that I can really think of that would kind of, be really beneficial in this instance. So I take each kind of, each project on its own merit. Sometimes I use reference tracks. In terms of calibrating, yeah, certainly when it comes to, I've just got these new speakers and I'm using the Focal Twin Alpha Evos, and they're dual 6.5-inch drivers with, I think it's a 1-inch tweeter. So because I've only had these probably around about 6 weeks, then obviously using reference tracks to really kind of get used to these speakers. So things that I've mastered before, things that I've been listening to for years, just playing them all through these speakers so I can really kind of get to know how these speaker sounds. But I think this is the other thing as well, is kind of get people to understand is when it comes to things like speakers as well, where there's so many different choices, and people say, well, you got to have this one because this isn't hyped, or this one because it is hyped, and things like that. Really kind of get to know a library of music. Because once you get to know it on certain systems, you can start to hear for deficiencies in other systems and playback systems. So like I said, if you've got a main pair of monitors, if you've got a smaller pair of monitors, or a phone, or one of those little Wi-Fi box things, or Bluetooth speakers, things like that, really kind of build up a repertoire of individual speakers so you can get to hear how your library of tracks sounds on different playback systems. Because if you can do that, then ultimately you're going to know when you start listening to music on systems that you're not familiar with, then you've got a bit more of a broader understanding as to how that song sounds on the systems that you are familiar with, and you can make different decisions based on any deficiencies in that new setup. So referencing can be certainly great from that aspect.
That's such a good point. I guess let's do one more question, and then let's get into the meat of the matter. Remo Prod asks, what was the most challenging project you worked on so far? And I guess why? What made it challenging?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably say that the classical piece was, that was probably the most challenging, because you're looking at something that is extremely dynamic, and I'm talking start at the piece, we're looking at minus 20 dBs on the peak level, up to the end at around -1. So you've got a massive amount of dynamic range in there. So it's trying to get a good overall balance without squashing, because once again, it's trying to think of how can you retain that intimacy and the emotion, whilst also making sure that the end of the track isn't too squashed. So that was a really interesting piece to work on. And once again, it was the Tchaikovsky piece, and it was the 1812 overture. I can't remember the exact name of the track, but it's the one that it comes almost towards the end, and you got the big cannons coming in. And this was the particular track where one of the cannons, it was like a delay effect. So it was coming from the right hand side, the cannon was going off and then delaying across the left hand side of the stereo field. But when the cannon was actually shooting, it was clipping. So that was quite an interesting one where I had to think about how can you creatively fix it without necessarily compromising the sound. And it was trying to think of all different ways. And in the end, it was kind of splitting the stereo file and then using some form of take effects in there. I don't think I did it with a limiter. I think in the end I used some form of clipper just on those particular peaks. But that was really one of those ones where you have to kind of rack your brains as to how can you do it in a manner that's not going to compromise the whole track. Because if you start even a take effect across the whole stereo part of that track, obviously it's going to start to squash very quickly. Whereas if you then can take it apart, dismantle it, and just do a little bit on that particular peak, you're going to get a much more natural sound and just kind of bring everything back in and control it. So that was quite an interesting one. But once again, it's the dynamic range element was very fun to work with. I think we did a little bit we're experimenting with some automation, and because you can really kind of go to town on something like that. And I think we kind of experimented with it and kind of scaled it back. So there were so many different ways that we could have taken it, but that was probably a challenging one to date.
Yeah, classical. And was that a real orchestra? That it was like a kind of like a recording of a live orchestra?
No, that was a very, very talented musician, and it was all MIDI. And it was used, I don't know if it was one of the BBC symphonies or something like that they used, one of the Spitfire libraries.
Okay, nice.
But some of the elements were just amazing. There's so many different velocity layers going through the track. It was really, really good. There were certain parts where, and this is once again, there's certain things where you've got to make certain elements sound a little bit more natural. So when you're using things like, the tape emulation to try and make it a little bit less digital. But there are some parts in those types of tracks as well where you might have to get in and do some actual editing. And I think we did a little bit of spectral editing in there, just kind of, if you had almost like a very digital artifact in there, or a sound that was coming across as too digital, we could get in there and just manipulate those a little bit as well. So, that was all. It was a real fun piece to work on. But it was just the craftsmanship of just doing it all through MIDI. It was just amazing to listen to.
Very cool. So we thought maybe today you will walk us kind of through your mastering process of that track. Maybe you can tell us what you would do differently today, because I think that was like September of last year where we worked on this. And then we thought if there's time, we'll get you to maybe do like a quick live mastering of one of Leandro's mixes, if there's time.
Yeah, we can certainly go through it. So absolutely. So what we'll do is we'll start going through it now. And what I've done is I've got the original master and I've got an alternative version, because I know when we spoke it was kind of like we did discuss of, well, what would you do something differently? And I kind of almost prepped this beforehand, and I'll get into that into a little bit later on. But to start with, let's have a quick look here. Have we got the screen capture, the screen share up on the stream at the moment?
No, can you share your screen on Skype?
On Skype. Does it come through?
Bear with us while we try to do this.
Yeah, I still don't see your screen share here on Skype.
Just doing Skype stuff. Skype just gives me the wheel, even though I'm totally seeing all of you and everything's fine. If I go and click on anything, it's just the wheel.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Yeah.
There we are. Great stuff. So what I've done here is I've got an original master. So I've got the original master here. And I've done kind of a bit of an alternative. And the alternative, we'll discuss a little bit later. I've left the processing relatively the same. We've actually taken it in a slightly different direction. But we'll come on to come on to that, say, later, as we discussed. In terms of the individual processing, once we've got the 440 tape machine, and then for this one I actually used Ozone 9 because there's quite a lot of different manipulation that we can do inside of Ozone. You can still do a lot of this with individual plugins, but when it comes to mid-side processing and the way I
have Ozone open right now on your screen, because we only see your Reaper screen.
Not yet.
Okay.
What about now? It's not coming up.
Oh, now it came up. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
Sorry
just
about
I
that.
didn't have it open there.
Cool.
So one of the things that I would recommend to anyone when it comes to just starting to master is think about the loudness first. I know we've spoken about this, haven't we, in terms of, let me just quickly get rid of that because that's a stream. We don't need that anymore. But I know we've spoken about loudness, haven't we, in the past, and around about loudness standards and things like that. And one of the tips that I would recommend to anyone, especially if you're new to mastering, is how do you get your track to a relative loudness without compromising the overall sound. And a good tip for anyone to start with is actually to start with the limiter first. I know this might sound a little bit counterproductive. The problem with using the limiter last is once you start to do all your processing, you've then got to think about your overall loudness, and you've got to think about compression and dynamics and energy. So if you leave limiting to last, you may run the risk of starting to squash the overall master just for the sake of getting some loudness. So if you're certainly if you're new to it, maybe start with a limiter first. And there's lots of different ways you can do this. Like I said, if you've got a lot of headroom, then maybe think about maybe normalizing it to, say, -2, -3 dB, so you haven't got to start pushing a load of gain into the limiter. So if I'm going to quickly go through here, and let me just bypass these to start with.
Hang on, let me ask you something. When you say start with the limiter, do you mean in the effects chain you put the limiter first and then other things like EQ? Or do you mean just start working on the limiter and then put other effects before it?
Yep, so exactly that. So start with the limiter. So you'll see here what I've got is I've got the individual track with the individual processing. And for the sake of this, I've got the actual limiter on the master track. So I've actually, because the reason I've done this is because of the automation elements. There is a little part of automation here. So automation comes post effects as far as I could see on the individual track. So what I wanted to ensure that I did is to control the overall level post automation. So I've actually put the limiter on the master track with the actual main individual processing on the individual tracks on the track effects themselves. So you'll see here I've got the limiter on the master. And in here we are using the stealth limiter. That's come up on the screen there. Great. So one of the things I love about this particular limiter is we've got all sorts of different ways that we can use this. So we've got the output ceiling and the input. So from that perspective, it's very, very simple. But we've actually got the ISPLs, which is the intersample peak limiter. And when we're talking about intersample peaks, this is very much when it comes into allowing or ensuring we've got sufficient I don't want to use the word headroom, but we need to ensure we've got a sufficient safety margin before it gets uploaded to the digital streaming platforms. So we've got a ceiling here of -1.3. When it gets uploaded, they'll go through a conversion process to upload it to the streaming platforms, and that's the point when you might start to introduce intersample peaks. And this is going to actually, by allowing us to put this into kind of 16 times, think of it almost like an oversampling, but it's very much kind of aimed at those intersample peaks. And with the rest of this, I'm not worried about dithering because we're not looking at anything in terms of sample rate conversion. And then we've got this is kind of like a default ultrasonic filter, and I like the mode type, but we've got different modes here, so you can choose like a balanced harmonics and different harmonics elements as well. So let's just quickly. If we take a listen here, if we put that in bypass, do you want to have a listen to the track before we've done anything at all? So this is going to be your raw track before the mastering. Where do you want me to start? Do you want me to play just a part of the track, maybe halfway through?
Yeah.
So let's go from here, because this is probably certainly my favourite part. And in fact, we'll do it here because it kind of, you have a main verse element that goes into a nice mellow section before we get almost a bit more of a crescendo. So let's take a listen to it from here. Great stuff. So what was the inspiration behind this track, Aria?
So I was, what year would this be? It would almost be 10 years ago. I went to the Kurdistan region, which falls in modern day Turkey, and a bit of it goes in Iraq and also Iran. So we went there, and we were, my friend Chetin, he was doing a documentary about the Kurdish people and specifically like their music style, which is kind of different than all the surrounding regions, I would say. And especially in that a lot more like female musician participation goes on in there. So anyway, that's where I wrote the song, and I think I was pretty much inspired by kind of some of the stuff I heard. But the song itself, like rhythmically, it's not very Kurdish sounding. I think harmonically it is. But the rhythm is more just kind of a regular 6/8, you know. And then I thought, I feel like that's kind of a trope that I have, where I start with like one layer and it grows into a lot. So I gotta at one point break out of that with my new music. It's still like starts slow, very quiet, and then by the end it's like nutty.
Yeah, no, that's great. So what I'm going to actually suggest is maybe we'll start right about here at the end, because one of the things that we will have a little bit of a challenge in terms of the overall loudness. So what I've got here is on the monitor effects chain, I've got the DP meter 5, which is the loudness meter that I use. I'm a big fan of the TB Pro Audio stuff. They used to do, I don't know if they still do, but they used to do a lot of the JS effects, but not a lot of them. I think there was about 4 or 5 JS effects plugins they used to do natively. So have you heard of the ABLM plugin, which is like a loudness matching type plugin?
I've not used it.
Yeah, well, they do a version of that as a JSFX, which is great. So if if you don't have the, I think the actual main version is about £80 or something like those, but €80. But if there's a JSFX version, it's something to use. But this one's a free one. It's the DP Meter 5, and this gives you everything you need from a loudness perspective. So just to give people a bit of an update here, you've got different presets here and different measurements you can analyze in. The way I use it is in the EBUR 128 mode. So for some reason this isn't letting me flip between the presets, but it doesn't matter. So the EBUR 128 is they set the loudness standard for Europe, and it's the ITU 1770 is the loudness standard for the US. But this is going to give you your integrated loudness, short term, and your momentary loudness. And these are the measurements we use for modern day mastering for streaming platforms, as well as things like true peak and the loudness range. It might be worth as a very good segue, just while we're talking about loudness, is one of the things that you may or may not know is some of the streaming platforms will ask for a master to be sent to them with a true peak level of -1 dB with an integrated loudness figure of -14 LUFS. What's your thoughts on this? Have you guys got much of a thought on this about in terms of loudness standards and the loudness measures? Because it's something we spoke about, isn't it, Aria, before around it's when we did this final master. I think it was coming around about -12.6 LUFS integrated, wasn't it? And I think it was one of the questions you asked around, well, should it be -14? This is just my opinion, and this is my opinion based on my experiences. But the thing with loudness standards and loudness normalization is there is no consistency in the industry. So for example, you've got how many ever different streaming platforms out there? So if you think it's probably at least 10 or 15 major players, Spotify, Apple Music, etc., they all have slightly different loudness standards or normalization levels. So the whole -14 thing for me is a little bit of a misnomer in the fact that you can't get it. If you used to do it at -14 for one, it's not guaranteed that it's going to be -14 for another. For example, Apple Music, I think they've only just within the last month changed to LUFS as their measurement. I think it's still -16. So if you say master specifically for Spotify at -14, then when you release it through, I don't know, DistroKid, etc., when they send it across to Apple Music, they're going to turn it down by 2 dBs to get it to -16. So there's no consistency in the market. So people say, well, why do you not master to -14 LUFS? And there's a few reasons for this. Is A, because there's no consistency amongst the streaming platforms, but secondly, there's so many different ways that they will normalize the music anyway. So, for example, if you master as part of an album or as part of an EP, then the true intention of the streaming platform would be to normalize based on the loudest track in that EP or album. So you're going to still have that natural flow as it was intended during the mastering process. But if it's then picks out as part of a playlist, it will normalize based on the playlist and not the album. So therefore, it then starts to look at the playlist, the loudest song in the playlist, and you'll get a completely different result. So the normalization isn't just a one and done. It is done instantaneously every time effectively you listen to that song based on how you listen to it. So even if you did it at -14, it doesn't mean the actual playback's going to be at -14 anyway. It depends on in the context in which it's being listened to. And, there's so many different ways it will do. So the whole -14 thing as a hard and fast rule is kind of, to me, it's almost irrelevant. I'm also not of the other camp, though, where everything has to be -6 or -8 and you just have to smash it just to get it as loud as possible. The thing is, there's so much space in between, and it's about you finding the level which you feel is the most comfortable. I personally will be at somewhere between -10 and -14. I don't look to smash it. -10 it wouldn't be for a track like this. That'll be for something that that can handle a little bit more compression, that doesn't need so much dynamic range. For something that's more dynamic, I would tend to be more on the conservative side, because you want to retain those dynamics. So you don't want to be pushing the limiter so hard. You don't want to be compressing too much. But also, I don't see the point in mastering exactly to -14. I would generally be on the side of caution and be somewhere around. The most dynamic will probably be around about -13, -13.5, somewhere like that. So that is kind of my thought process in that respect. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think you converted me on this early on, and because one thing that I was kind of holding on to about this whole -14 thing was, I always thought, well, okay, people who say master to -6, then they'll upload it on Spotify. Spotify will turn it down a bunch. And then I thought, okay, well, if you master to -12, then your peaks, instead of being at -1, they're at -3. But then another friend of mine told me, well, okay, say that's the case, -1 and -3, do you actually hear the difference? You're just adjusting. So people think, oh, it's is it a huge deal if your peaks are at -3 instead of -1? Not really. It doesn't change your listening experience. And as you said, these standards change. So instead of trying to hit that number, you just hit a good sound, then you kind of check out. You know what LUFS you're reading.
And this is how things are changing over time. So the peak level it's important, but it's getting the balance between the peak and the perceived loudness, which is where you get the LUFS. So even if you say drop a couple of dBs on the peaks and you do get a little bit of compression, I think everyone. Okay, let's rephrase that. Not everyone, but it kind of, the consensus seems to be either it has to be maximum dynamics or it has to be maximum loudness. But there's so much space in between, where if the skill is finding the balance between the two, and you don't have to have everything extremely dynamic. It can can still have a little bit of compression in it to give it that overall, that glue and cohesion, without compromising the overall sound, and it will allow you to get that little bit more volume as well. And once again, it kind of goes back to that. Yeah, you might be losing a couple of dBs on the peaks, but you've got to remember as well that if you're raising the crests and bringing them back up, then you're making it up with that perceived loudness. So there's there's so many different trains of thoughts, but that's certainly the way I would look to do it, rather than kind of focusing on -14 or smashing the crud out of it. There's so much space in between, and that's the kind of philosophy that I would take. So,
and that's what you get with a human engineer, obviously, right? Because any AI tool would take a black metal song and a classical song and give you the same readings, once it's done.
Yeah,
so.
there was I'm trying to think what the engineer who it was explaining this once. There are some tracks that can just eat compression. They will just take compression all day long. Other tracks that they won't. So you can't have this kind of like this one and done philosophy. Every song is going to be completely different. So that's certainly my 2 pence worth on that matter. But I just think it's something that's probably quite important for people to understand, that you have these, they're not even targets, you have these measures out there, but they are designed to be for the streaming platforms and not for artists and engineers to follow. Just know that if you really start to smash things and do a damn well, what did it get to -2 integrated, or was it? It's like,
Yeah.
Then obviously it's not going to be ideal, but certainly fair play to him for being able to do that. So let's start with the self limiter.
Hang on, I have 2 questions about this actually. The first is, do you ever hear pushback from clients that want to push the limit and make the track louder?
No, because there's part of the engineer's role, certainly for me, is to educate the artist as well, because it's kind of, there's different ways of communicating it, and there are times when it's kind of not as loud as someone else. So then what you do is you make them as loud, and then what you can then do is do a volume match, and then say, okay, what one to you sounds better? And it's then when they listen to them back, well, it's generally the one that's not pushed so much sounds better. So it's about educating the clients as well, and saying, well, if you're going to put it through a streaming platform, if that's your main goal is just to release it to a digital online streaming platform, there is no point in actually smashing the hell out of it, because it's not going to achieve anything. And then it's kind of like showing them the difference between a more dynamic master and then a completely squash one, just to hit a nominal figure. So there is a big part there about educating the clients and artists as well.
Right. Okay. And my second question is, circling back to that whole notion of helping people get into mastering themselves, is, if I had a hard and fast rule I could follow, -14, target, just go for it and you'll be good, that would be relatively straightforward. But of course, there is more nuance to this, and you should be looking at, like you said, ranges of -10 to -14. So there is a lot of flexibility there. And as a beginner, how do you advise people to navigate this? Do you think that they should listen to other tracks and compare, or how do they find this sweet spot for their music?
It's a great question. It's a really, really good question. And I think first and foremost I would recommend people to understand the medium in which you will be releasing it. So if it's purely going to be online and digital, then I would certainly first and foremost advise caution. And then just, if you're going to start, this is what I'll show you in a second, actually. Where if you start with a limiter first, then if you aim for somewhere around, let's say, -14 integrated LUFS over the entire period of the song, because this is the other thing as well, is you need to measure the integrated measure is the measurement over the entire song. So if you use a limiter first to get it into that ballpark, then once you get to the individual track processing, if your gain staging isn't necessarily bang on, it doesn't really matter too much, as long as you're not adding a massive amount of gain in that stage. If you add maybe 1 or 2 LUs, ultimately it's not going to matter too much. But always come back to that whole thing of listen to the dynamics, keep on switching the plugins off, switching them back on again, and just listen for the changes, but be very intentional from the start as to what it is you want to do. And I think this is where I'd like to go with this, is to get people to start, or educating people on different ways to listen for certain things, because I think having this kind of mentality of, well, if you use these 4 plugins in this particular chain, and if you aim for this target, I don't think you're going to get great results there. And I think this is somewhere for me as an educator, I need to then kind of go, well, this is how you're going to listen for this particular. So for example, let's think about low end control. How do you control the low end? What are you listening for? What do you need to be aware of? And then think about things like, okay, well, I mentioned about the smiley face and the low end and the high end. What is it you need to listen for? what is it you need to start to highlight? And this is where us as educators need to get better at explaining that to our followers, rather than just going down, well, this is a basic chain, follow this chain, do it to this number and you'll have a great master, because it doesn't work like that. So I would always recommend just start real simple, maybe just go with the limiter first, get it into the ballpark, and then just think. Start with compression. What is it I need? How does my track sound overall? Does it sound like it's a little bit peaky and spiky in certain areas? If it does, then use a compressor with a very low ratio and just get maybe a dB worth of reduction. Leave it there. I need to think about the overall balance of the track and start to think about, okay, what do I need? Is there something I need to tweak on an EQ? Is it too loud in the low end, or is it not loud enough? Is there something that, think about something like a snare. Is the snare cutting through? Do I need to add a little bit more, maybe somewhere around about, it could be anywhere, maybe say around the 200, get that low end, say 200 to 600 range, maybe just a little bump, maybe let's say a dB there. That's where I'd like to go with this, rather than saying it's kind of like a one and done. Use these 5 plugins, master to this level, and you'll be done. Because I don't think that's going to give you the best results long term.
Raphael is asking about dithering. So do you want to give the dithering talk?
Not really.
Okay.
No, it's one of those things. So without going into the whole complexities of it, I think these days it should be, certainly from my opinion, it's one of those things that isn't really required as often as it should be, because this was something where if you're recording, so it's the difference between the bit depths effectively. So you've got the classic bit depths of 16 bits, you've got 24 bits, and now you've got 32-bit float. So in most of the recordings, I would always recommend mastering in the same bit depth as it's recorded, because if you recorded in 16-bit, and let's say you do a conversion up to 24, you're not going to add any more anything beneficial to the actual track. So if you're recording 16-bit, stick in 16-bit. If you're recording 24-bit, master at 24-bit. That would be my advice. The only time you'd really need to worry about dithering as such is if you wanted to do a CD burn or something like that, because in that respect, you then have to effectively do a 16-bit master for CD purposes. But CDs, it's very rare that most people will do some form of do some form of CD run these days anyway. So from that perspective, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But the general principle is, if you need to reduce the bit depth of your track, dither. Simple as that. Don't even think about it. Just dither. Just have it done. But if you're going to have natively stay in the same bit depth as you started in, the track was in 24-bit and you mastered 24-bit, you're not going to change anything by dithering it, at that same bit depth. So if you're going down, then certainly, dither. But it's almost one of those conversations now where it doesn't really need to happen quite so much as it should.
There's a good Dan Worrell video on it on the Fab Filter channel. I think it's called Introduction to Mastering or something like that. And if you want 20 minutes on dithering, go check that out.
Yeah, it's a bit like, it's an important technical piece to know, but the reality of it is that it doesn't matter necessarily as much as it did do, and therefore it doesn't matter quite so much now as maybe it did, say, 10, 15 years ago. And it's a bit like the whole loudness thing, and it's certain things of, I think people get so, they see mastering as this big challenge, whereas reality is if you just have the basic concepts and relax into it, it's much more, it's not as daunting as people make it out to be. And I think that's possibly where that dithering things kind of comes into the equation as well.
Before we move on, I actually have another question that is more of a curiosity. We usually talk about loudness and we start throwing around terms like compression and limiters. But does it ever happen to you that you have a track that perhaps is too compressed and maybe it's a restoration project, you don't have access to the stems to do a remix or to ask someone to do a remix, so you really have to get back some dynamic range? So do you ever use expanders and these sorts of tools?
There are tools out there, but I would still go back to that whole thing is, without being crass about it, but you can't polish a turd. And it is a bit like that. And it's kind of going back to the client and saying, well, look, I can do some bits to try and fix this, but to get the best result, I really, we really need to look at the overall compression and then think about the, I've had it with a previous client of mine. It was a bit of a hard rock track and it was very much kind of pushed. And this is going back to the client and saying, well, look, if we just had the overall compression just down a little bit on the overall, I think they must have used some form of bus compression. And it's just saying, if we can kind of back that off a little bit, it will allow me to be able to do a much better job rather than trying to think about things of like expanders and companders and things like that. There's so many different, tools that are out there, but then still not going to get you the same result. So I would always default go back to the client and say, is there a possibility, rather than me having stems, go back to the mix engineer, whoever mixed it, whether it's them who mixed it or they got someone else to mix it for them. I love this. It's a great question you asked this, and this is one of the things that I would like to highlight as well. Is if you have a different mix engineer and master engineer, I think one of the big takeaways I would ask, if you're working with either as a mix engineer with a master engineer, or if you're a master engineer working with a mix engineer, just my one key takeaway is just remember, it is not your song, it's the client's song. And this is a thing where it's kind of I just want to go back to it. It's a team game. You are not, you got to think about the end result. It's the client's music. The client wants the best product possible. Let your ego go out the window. If there's a master engineer, the client or the mix engineer comes back and says, I think you've done something that I don't particularly like. Can you try this? As a master engineer, go back to the mix engineer and say, can we maybe have a little bit less compressed, or maybe just do it? Work as a team. And I do think there is so much ego in the industry that I think that's one of the things that I would also like to change as well, is the attitude towards other engineers. We're not there to nitpick and pinpoint errors in your knowledge. It's there to work as a team. Just think about the end goal, which is the client's song and getting that best result for the client. Is that enough rants for today? I think there must be enough rants for today, isn't it?
There are some questions in the chat, but I'm saving them for the post Q&A. So yeah, we'll let Darren walk us a little bit through the process.
So let's go through this then. So we're going to start with here. I'm going to preach what we talk. Let's start with the actual limiter itself. So let's start with the limiter, and this is the T-Rex Stealth limiter. I'm going to keep this pinned up here, which is the loudness meter. Now with this particular plugin itself, I've had to do a little bit of manipulation here, and I wouldn't necessarily put quite this much gain. So this is the gain input, and this is the ceiling. So this is going to be where the limiter caps, and this is where the input, the amount of gain that's going to go into it. I wouldn't necessarily put 4 dBs worth of a gain as a general rule of thumb, and this is why we'll see we've actually got another plugin here which is coming before the limiter, but it's just going to start to add some overall volume. So if we go here, and let's just start from our loop point. Let's take a brief listen now. I'm going to quickly bypass the limiter just so you've got an idea of the overall volume. So it's a limiter. It's not particularly that exciting. One of the things I just want you to be aware of here is the gain reduction. You don't want to be getting too much gain reduction here. Now, because I'm using this in isolation, you would have noticed that at the peak there would have been 3.5 dBs worth of gain reduction. But what we're going to show you now is actually going to start using a clipper before it. So one of the biggest challenges when it comes to any form of limiting is overstressing the limiter itself. So you will see many people, and myself especially, talk about stacking limiters. If you get to a stage where you're really starting to force a limiter and you're putting, say, 5, 6, 7 dBs worth of gain into a limiter, you're going to start to stress that limiter. And what I mean by that is you're going to start getting far too much compression, you'll start getting artifacts, and that is not something you want. So what you can start to think about doing is maybe using another limiter, so using 2 limiters in tandem, one before the other. Or what I've done in this particular instance is use a clipper. So the difference between using a limiter and a clipper, obviously the limiter is going to start to compress, where a clipper is literally going to clip the peaks. So what I've actually done here as well is used a classic clipper. So if we get this up as well, hopefully that's going to come up on your screen now. And once again, I'm not doing too much with this. So the output I've kind of left where it is at default is 0 dB because I'm putting a little bit of gain in there. So rather than putting 6 dBs worth of gain into one limiter, I've got a clipper here at 1.9 dB. So that's just adding that little bit more. So let me just quickly, what I'm going to do here. Let me just see if I can, let's get rid of that. We don't need that for a time. In fact, this we will. Leave that down there. So if we then move that over there, so we've got the clipper, it's going into the clipper first and then going into the final limiter. So it's just another way just to add a little bit more volume to the actual overall track without starting to really stress the overall limiter. You could do this, once again, using a slightly different method by using a limiter here instead of a classic clipper. I don't always like to use 2 limiters because you are going to start introducing two levels of compression. But what you could do, let's say, do this slightly differently. Rather than the clipper, maybe use another instance of your limiter of choice and then use the ceiling on the first limiter, maybe not quite so much, maybe say minus 0.3. So it's literally just catching the peaks, putting a little bit worth of input, and then use your final limiter as the overall kind of brick wall to make sure there's no final clipping going through. I wouldn't worry too much here about this overall loudness, but you can see here, true peak max is minus 1.1. You've got your momentary loudness max, and you've got your short-term max. They're coming in relatively hot, but it's your integrated you want to worry about. So it's going to be the level of the track all the way through. So that is a real simple approach to getting some level into the track first. You might not even want to push these quite so hard to start with, but it's just the way I mastered the original track.
While we're on the topic of declippers, Mage is asking, are any of the declip plugins effective? If you know about them, I personally don't. And Brandon is asking, do you recommend oversampling clippers?
Yes, I mean, I would generally, if there's an option to do so, I'd certainly do so. As I did here with the Intersample peak limiter, this is effectively going to act as an oversampling because that's effectively what it's doing. Is it's looking at your Intersample peaks, and then with the
hang on, but it's only looking at the Intersample peaks for the sidechain. That is going to be the key for the limiter, right? It's not actually doing any oversampling in the limiting itself.
In terms of, it shouldn't do. No, it's not a side chain. It's not a side chain filter. It's applying the Intersample peak limiting across the overall track.
I guess what I'm saying is it's not doing oversampling on the actual audio that it's outputting. It's not trying to prevent distortion.
Yeah, it will do from the limiter.
Oh, okay.
So what it's not doing it. I can see what you're saying, but that's basically what it is. It's looking at your final output. That's the way that this is going to be designed. I don't think there is an oversampling on the classic clipper. But yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, oversampling. I would, because this is one of the things as well. When it comes to, we were looking at Nyquist, you've got then the toss-up between sample rate or oversampling. And I would always recommend the route of oversampling first for any kind of saturation or for, anything like that which is going to add saturation. So certainly look at your oversampling. But as my understanding with this stealth limiter is that this Intersample peak limited is doing it across the source that's going through. So it's going to be your final signal before it goes out to wherever it needs to go. So if you use this as a final render, this should be doing it, not as a side chain, but it should be doing this overall.
And of course, Reaper now has oversampling, so you can oversample plugins that don't have that feature. I think with clippers, like because of them cutting the waveform, they are essentially saturating the moments that they are clipping, right, Leandro? Because they are like squarifying.
So if you look here, so for me, I would expect this to have some form of oversampling on there.
I've never used you and John Tidy are the only people I know who use T-Rack stuff. but it seems to be good stuff.
Yeah, they do some good stuff, but it's one of those things. Is you got to pick your times and moments with them. Would I pay £200 per plugin? No, but if they do a group buy, would I pay £200 and get 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe something like that free? Yeah, I would. They are good, but I wouldn't use them. I don't use them exclusively. The Stealth Limiter is one I would use. The reason I use this classic clipper, I would normally use the V clip. I don't know, was it D clip? See, D clip. When we talk about D clip, are we talking about is it DE then clip? Mentioned in the questions.
Is that what you mean, Mage? Let us know. I think so.
If it's DE clip, then that's going to be something like RX. So they've got a D clip plugin. In fact, I've probably got it on here, where you've got Isotope. Here we are.
I've always used that on like source material. I use it in like dialogue editing. I've never actually mastered with it personally.
Yeah, I wouldn't personally. I mean, it's something you could do and see what results you get. But once again, it kind of goes back to the whole question of it's not going to be ideal. And in that respect, I would then always go back to the mix engineer, the client, and say, can we just have the overall level down before it gets to the mastering stage?
You always get artifacts, but if it's a live interview and it's with, say, Steve Jobs or whatever, Steve Jobs is dead, so you just fix the clipping and don't worry about the artifacts. But with mastering, I don't know.
Well, I mean, you've got to try and do what you can try, but it's always one of those things where if you can get it right at the source, then try and get it right at the source. So now we've got some rough overall loudness. Is then we're going to start going into here, which is the TR5 tape. And this is why I put it onto the individual tracks. So this is going to be the track processing, and that's going to be overall master. So let's have a quick look here. And this, once again, is just a 440 finish. I'm not going to start going through the individual elements of this particular plugin because, quite frankly, a lot of it I don't really understand too much. I know some rough about about the bias and the IPs and things like that, the speed but I'm not an expert on tape machines, but I do know this sounds great. So one of the things, let's bypass, it's in bypass now. And what I'm going to engage it, and what I want you to listen for is the mid-range.
Okay.
And then see if you can spot, hopefully it'll be relatively obvious where this kind of gives it a nice mid-range boost. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to actually go back a little bit in the song here as well, because this is probably a little bit more where you're going to get much more natural sounds. Let's take a listen to here. So just for me, it just allows the things just to poke out a little bit more, and it's not so focused. I mean, it's certainly going to give a little bit more life to the lows and highs, but it's more that mid-range. It kind of just really brings it out. And once again, this is the only plugin that I'll use that's based on the preset. But I always default back to this and try this as much as I can, and pretty much 99% of the time, I love the sound I get from this particular plugin.
I also felt, I don't know if anybody else, I don't know, Leandro, if you heard it, or let us know in the chat if you heard it. When you unbypassed it, I also felt just a slight amount of widening, which I really liked as well. Especially as I was hearing like the backing vocals. Very nice.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. It probably get mentioned time and time again, but when it comes to things like using the saturation, is to remember that saturation is a form of compression. So it's kind of like just to understand that. So rather than kind of using a saturator, then you go into a mastering bus compressor, then you go into a multiband compressor, then you got a limiter. Think about your overall dynamics, because effectively you could be, before you know it, racking up 4 levels of compression. So with this particular track, I didn't need to do a stereo-based compression, because what I was getting here, achieving here with the overall limiting and with the tape saturation is kind of doing that glue for me. So I really like the results there. But like you say, it's probably because of the fact that it's bringing up the overall level of each and all of the stereo field, that you're starting to get that bit more of that width as well. So then once we've actually got that, that's pretty much a one and done. But this is where it starts to get interesting. And I think when I wrote in my email back to you is kind of, I think I likened it as one of the challenging masters that I've done, but in a good way. And this is why, because I didn't really feel the need to do too much. And you're going to start to notice here, the reason why I chose using ozone is because of the amount of manipulation you can do, but in a gentle and subtle way. So, for example, I've started off with dynamics first. So I'm not using any form of, stereo bus or stereo mastering compression. I'm just using a small bit of dynamics compression just to control the low end. So what this is actually doing here, this is going to control one band up to 148 hertz. So it's just giving low end control on the mid frequencies only. So this is very much focusing on the kick and the bass and just giving that low end control. So what we can do here is, if we quickly, let's bypass that. And what I think it's around here is the drones, the bass drones. So if we take another listen here with this engage, it's very, very subtle, which is giving a little bit of control. And if we move back here a little bit when that kick comes in.
Oh, I'm hearing the sound from somewhere else too. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. So what this allows you to do is actually, it allows you to solo the band that you're processing. So what this is actually doing is it's just going to solo that mid band, that mid frequencies up to 148 hertz. And it allows you to really hone in on the actual sound that you're trying to achieve. So if we start right here again, you're just going to hear those mono frequencies. So it's literally just using it as low-end control. That is pretty much where it is. It's not doing anything dramatic. We're literally talking not even really a dB's worth of compression. It's just so subtle, just maybe, 0.5 of a dB, maybe up to -1 dB, but it is just getting that subtle bit of control on the low end. So that is where we are. That's what I did with the actual dynamics element here. But then we start going into things like dynamic EQ. And this is, once again, this is really just focusing on certain individual elements, because there was nothing really poking out, but it's how can I enhance it a little bit further? And what I've got here is just one small band of a little bit of dynamic EQ, and it's just 1.6K, and we're literally less than a dB's worth of gain reduction. Because it's a dynamic EQ, it's actually going to have a little bit of compression, but it just allows a little bit more snap. So if we take another listen about there. Just once again, it's on the mid frequencies only, so I'm not doing it on the stereo, it's on the mids only.
Sorry, one quick question. Leandro, are you hearing this doubled, or am I the only one? that it's happening to?
I don't think I'm hearing it double, no.
Oh, okay. Let us know in the chat if it sounds weird. Otherwise, I think I just did something accidentally. Sorry, keep going, Darren.
No, let's bypass this first. So it really is subtle, but once again, it's just adding a little bit more snap and attack to those particular frequencies. And this is the thing: it's when it comes to mastering, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. It's just adding subtle little articulations that's going to give that little bit more of an enhancement to the overall track. Now,
I'm wondering how kind of you arrived at that particular band. So do you kind of solo and sweep through and find, or how do you kind of arrive where you arrived?
Yeah, it's not. I don't really solo as such. What I have in mind, what I want to aim for. So I'd always, as soon as I start a mastering project, I'll always start to listen to the track maybe 2 or 3 times and think, okay, where's my mind going with this? And there's certain things of certain elements is where you can start to create or add a little bit more energy. And then just thinking about where do you need to add that energy? What sound is it that's really poking out to you? Say, for instance, if it's the crack of the snare, or you just want to add a little bit more mid-range energy, but then you've also got to think about the stereo field. Where do I want to apply it? Do I want to apply it across every single instrument, or do I really want to be tactical with it? So, for instance, in this particular example, once again, it's back in the mid frequencies. So I'm looking more at the things like the snare, even maybe some more. I mean, around that frequency, you're going to get a little bit more of the bass pick and things like that. So it's being very particular. So rather than necessarily sweeping, it's more trying to be more intentional with the faults, and then think where at that stage you then got to start to think where you can go with that particular frequency itself. So it could be a good idea to sweep, but I wouldn't necessarily suggest doing it in solo. So it's certainly if you're trying to build your ear, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it in solo, because everything's going to sound
weird. Yeah
exactly. So do it in the context of the actual mix itself, but try and be more intentional, which is why you will see here pretty much all of the processing I'm doing is either in mid or side mode. I don't think I've done anything except for the limiting and the tape saturation. That's the only things I've done in stereo. The rest of it has been more intentional, just to create a little bit more energy. So let's just quickly did we listen to that in solo as the individual band? I think we did, didn't we? So now let's just go into the actual EQ itself, and then this one's the mid EQ, and you'll see here I've got another one which is going to be the side EQ. And the reason why I'm doing these independently, because once again I'm being very, very intentional with the actual frequencies I'm targeting. So to start with, here we've got just it's just a simple high cut, and we're looking at high pass there at 35 hertz, nothing too much, but this is just taking out the actual rumble itself. So if we start to play some here, and if we solo this, it's pretty much inaudible, but it's just taking, it just adds a little bit of clarity. It's one of those things where you don't notice it if it's in solo, but it's kind of adds up over time. If you listen to the final and you use to bypass it, it's just kind of, just by taking it out, it gives a little bit more clarity overall in the low end, and a bit more definition in the low end. So we started there with just a flat high pass 35 hertz there, and then we've got a little bump here in the low end. So this once again is going to be something more around the bass. I don't know how. Did you do anything with the kick? So sometimes a lot of people, when they're mixing the kick and the bass, they will roll off the bass at a certain frequency, and they will let the kick breathe in that particular area. Can you remember doing anything like that in the mix?
It's been a while, so I'm not sure. But I think because in this song the bass was more important. I think I cut some stuff from the kick to make the bass sit where it sits, and my kind of the way I thought about it was that like the clickiness of the kick is gonna be kind of more its identity.
Yeah. I mean, that's effectively kind of the same philosophy that I've used here, because when it comes to the process of working out what needs to be done, it's very much kind of trying to highlight what the artist's intent is, and you can tell all the way through the track that the bass is very much an important part of the sound, whereas the kick, it doesn't need to be quite so pronounced. It needs to have that control, but it doesn't have to be so loud. And that's one of the things here, is just using just a small, once again, a little 0.5 dB gain increase here on the mid frequencies only. So it's very targeted, quite a wide Q. So even though it's kind of, it says 131 hertz, it's actually going to be sweeping out, and from, say, where's that, around 300 down to 60. So it's achieving quite a nice overall mid-range or mid-band warmth that you're going to get from that low end. So let's just quickly solo that. And once again, it is so subtle. One of the things that we're going to find out in a minute is when we actually start to bypass the whole plugin, you may not really notice too much happening when I do these individual changes. But when we actually start to bypass the entire plugin, the total sum hopefully will be completely different. And then we got a bit more of a mid-range bump here. And once again, it's another 0.5 dB. And this is going to be, once again, just giving some more emphasis to that, those mid frequencies. So once again, you'll be looking more at the snare and things like that, and quite likely the vocal. I'm trying to think, I can't recall back to see why I exactly did this, but sometimes actually when you think about these particular frequency, sometimes it's actually giving the vocal a little bit more presence in that particular area as well. So let's bypass that and let's take another listen. For me, it's just giving that a little bit more mid-range energy as well.
Yeah, it definitely also, because it's in the mid and a lot of the vocals are like panned, I think it kind of like anchors it down in a nice way. I always thought in this mix, like my vocals were the weak point, and this is like a very subtle. Of course, I should, again, I could go back to the mix and maybe bring all the vocals in a little more in retrospect, but I think this is a very nice and kind of neat fix to over wide backing vocals and stuff.
Yes, let's take a brief listening solo.
Does anybody hear that brrrr kind of sound? Maybe it's just me. I hear like a brrrr kind of sound, which is kind of interesting. I'm like, I wish that was in my mix.
But once again, it's going back to, it's adding that little bit more of that snap from that snare as well. So all of that was done on the mids.
Hang on, I want to ask you something. You are doing something interesting to me. You're soloing a band, and then you are engaging and disengaging the EQ move that you made.
Yep.
But because that band is isolated, shouldn't that just amount to a difference in volume in that band? So when you are A-Bing just that band, you're just listening to the difference in volume?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's exactly, because everything's volume, isn't it? Everything we do is volume. EQ, compression, even saturation to a degree is compression, which is volume. It's just how you apply it. So yes, but what I'm specifically looking for is enhancing volume in intentional areas. So, for instance, if we're looking at this, if I want to increase the volume of the low end to highlight, say, the bass guitar, then that's basically what I'm looking for. Just a little volume increase in that particular area, like with the actual snap of the snare itself. Just trying to increase the volume in that area, and to not only do that, but to listen for a little bit more energy as well. Because I think that's what this particular EQ move is doing. But you're absolutely right. It's just volume. but it's just making sure that volume is tactical.
I guess when it's like a mid and you bypass it, does it then still like just apply to the mid? You know what I mean? Like, so when you're bypassing it, is it unmidding as well in this case?
It shouldn't be, no.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't hearing so.
It's isolating the mid frequencies. So because what you've got here is you've got the left and right stereo and mid side, and then you can choose between the mids and the sides here.
I gotcha.
So this is why I've been with this EQ and this EQ here. So this is very much going to be your side frequencies, and this is going to be your mid frequencies. But what we can do.
Sorry, one quick question too. Raphael is asking. He's asking like you had a little bit of a dynamic EQ around kind of the 1K frequency range, and then and now here you're boosting. So could you explain that? Like the cut and the boost.
Yeah, so if you think about a dynamic EQ isn't working like a conventional EQ. It's actually working more like a compressor. So what you're going to start to find is, because it's compressing that particular range, it's actually going to even out the sound a bit more. So if you think of what a compressor does, it attenuates the peaks but raises the troughs, so it gives you a much more even sound. So I wouldn't think of a dynamic EQ as almost like a cut. Yes, you are cutting that particular area, but what that's actually doing is compressing that area rather than actually cutting it like a conventional EQ would. But what you're actually doing here is kind of you're evening the sound out with the EQ and just adding a little bit more back in with the normal EQ. So it's kind of giving you some control and consistency, then giving you a little bit of a volume boost in that area. So that's pretty much the philosophy of using the dynamic EQ in conjunction with a normal EQ. So think of the dynamic EQ more of a compression technique rather than an EQ technique.
Great explanation.
And then we can go on to we'll go on to the next equalizer, and this is once again very much kind of focused on the side frequencies, and this is very intentional, just around 3.6k, and once again 0.7 dBs wide Q to kind of capture a vast area, and this is very much just giving a little bit more. It will sound hopefully a little bit more width. So let's take a listen around. Let's go towards the end. You can certainly hear the enhancement of certainly like the overheads coming through there. What was panned out to the sides? Because to me, it's sort of the usual thing for me is things like guitars, overheads, things like that. Is that pretty much typical of the mix? Can you recall?
Yeah, and then effects. So because I have like lots of guitars and they're not necessarily doubled, sometimes I feel like instead of like doubling and kind of crowding up the mix, what I do is like the guitar that's like 50% left has an effect that's panned all the way right, and vice versa. So it gives it that kind of width without kind of crowding up the mix.
Yeah, like a classic delay or reverb panned the opposite kind of
exactly
thing. Yeah,
exactly. Another question that I had, something that I see like it's almost one of those things that people just automatically do in the mastering realm, is they take the side and they high pass it so that the low end is very kind of mid focused. I'm seeing that you haven't done that here, and was that just because in the mix like that wasn't an issue for you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't do. There's some things that I don't do as a matter of course. It's like, once again, the whole low end mono thing. Some people will just do everything below 20 hertz. Right. And it's kind of like, I don't always do that. I kind of very much listen for what one. If there's so much, if I get to a stage where I feel that the low end is unbearable, yeah, then I might look to do something like that. And actually to take all the low frequencies out of the sides. But sometimes you've got to remember that if you think about some of these, how these instruments are recorded. I mean, the actual drums itself, the actual kick drum, for example, how was that recorded? Is that a MIDI drum, or was that live drums?
It's live, but the kick that I recorded on, I wasn't particularly in love with the sound, so I did add an extra sample like layer to just the kick. Everything else is just the acoustic.
Yeah. And were we looking stereo or was it all mono?
It was, I did just one kick mic. I did snare top and bottom. I mic'd up the toms, and actually only in one section you're hearing that, and otherwise you're just hearing the toms through the overheads.
Yeah. So it's all going to be mono anyway. So you know, certainly from that perspective, I don't really kind of worry about it. Once again, it's like the bass guitar. Usually is kind of be the guide. One of the things you might notice is if you've got, let's say, a lot of effects that are going to be panned or stereo effects that may be picking up some low rumble, then that's the kind of thing you certainly want to be kind of rolling off. Do you use like a high pass filter and any reverbs and things like that during the mixing phase, or was it kind of just kind of left it pretty natural?
No, I do. I high pass. When it comes to drums, I usually high pass everything but the kick. I may still do like a very kind of slight like de-rumbling high pass on the drum bus. On guitars and stuff, usually I don't find the need to. Already once you're going through an amp, you know, it's doing that.
Yeah.
So I leave it. Of course, for vocals, because there's always like unwanted sounds, I think, in vocals. So my fundamental is usually like around 90, I would say. So I just cut everything below. That's one of those things I do without even listening. I just do it.
No, exactly. But just once again, use your own ears. If you think there's a bit more of a low end build up, we use the dynamics for the low end in the mid frequencies. I felt personally that was enough control for the low end. But if you feel that there is a bit of build up on the sides, you want to take some of those low frequencies out, use something like a high pass filter or something like that, you know, and take that out. But I just didn't feel we needed particularly to do it in this instance.
Mm-hmm.
And
Cool.
this was a really interesting one, this one, because let me just play, if we go back to this area here, and I won't include the exciter for the time being. This is quite intentional. So I'm going to bypass the whole plugin, and then we'll bypass it, turn it back on again. So I just want to take a brief listen. So, you know, there's certainly some subtle, delicate moves there. But one of the things I just wanted to add was just a little bit of excitement. And I know, you know, we've got all different kind of plugins that we can use, but I didn't want to kind of go carte blanche with some form of exciter across the whole piece. And I was really trying to think of a particular area that I felt I wanted to kind of target. And this was probably a little bit where I did do a little bit of sweeping, because I didn't really want to do too much with the high frequencies, because we know there's a lot of high-end, let's call it excitement, at the top, certainly at the end of the track. And if you start to kind of excite that, you're going to just start putting far too much high end in. It's going to start to sound a bit harsh and brittle, and you probably need to start thinking about some form of de-essing to kind of take the overall top frequencies off. So I then started to kind of think about how I could just add a little bit of excitement and just a little bit of a different, let's for instance call it a warm saturation. That's pretty much what I did in this instance, and it's very focused once again on the mid frequencies. I didn't want to kind of start to affect the high end, so I've really focused on the mids, and this is really going to be picking up that low mids into the mid range. So things like bass, snare, that kind of thing. It's just going to give a little bit of excitement, a little bit more saturation to. But it actually, I feel it just gives it a little bit more energy in certain places. So let's take another listen. Let's bypass it first. So it's just such a really subtle sheen. It's not doing too much at all, but what it is doing is just adding that little bit more, I don't know how to describe it, kind of just a little bit of a sprinkle of fairy dust just in that particular area. It kind of just gives a little bit more once again, excitement is the right word, being the exciter, but it just adds that little bit of something there.
And this is not just on the mids, right? This is saturated.
This is just on the mids.
Ah, okay, cool.
In that particular area, because if I was to do it on the stereo, once again, it will start to affect a lot more of the actual natural stereo fields. And one of the things that was really conscious of is starting to add a little bit too much overall. So I really wanted to kind of give this focus, and this is why it took me. This is probably the most challenging part, because I knew that I had it almost where I wanted it, but it's just giving it that little bit of something else, just to kind of just raise it a little bit further. And it's just doing that little. It's it's so subtle. It's difficult to describe, but it is just kind of giving it that little bit more. It says warmth. I don't think it is giving it. It's warmth preset here. I don't think it is warmth. I think it's just more, a little bit of sparkle, a bit more snap, but a little bit more, just a bit something in that kind of that low mid range. It's so difficult to describe, but it is just giving a little bit more energy in that particular place there. So now we've got all that. Let's have a brief listen. Let's go back towards the end, and I'm going to bypass it to start with, and let's kind of engage it. So it's, once again, all those moves there are subtle. One of the things that really kind of highlights to me is just about balance. And that's effectively what just those few little things that we've done there is just achieving that little bit of balance. So if you notice when it was in bypass, it was more kind of top and bottom, but just adding those little things, a little few moves in there, it's just achieving that little bit more overall balance between the lows, the highs, and the mids, and just kind of bringing it all a little bit out a little bit more.
One thing, this really teaches me like why mastering is not particularly a strong suit for me. I think I have the like addict personality, so it's hard for me to do like a half dB move, because I'm like, okay, let's go 2 and then let's go 3 dB. Like I like to, when I find a nice change that I like to push it. Yeah. But it's more about like, because I think like all of these changes that you did, none of them really like change the identity of the song. The overall tone stays the same, but altogether they definitely amount to like a very nice enhancement, I think. Yeah,
but that is effectively, that is mastering. This is why I said it was challenging in a nice way, because the mix was a great mix. It's just adding that little bit, say another 5%. It's not a great deal that I'm adding to it. It's just adding those very subtle enhancements to give it that more overall natural balanced sound, and bringing out the just bringing out the natural elements that were already there. Really. Should we have a quick listen? If I just bypass the entire effects train on the track, should we have a quick listen now?
Sure.
So it's one of those things, it's kind of, it sounds more drastic than it actually does when you're looking at those different individual elements. And it's not, once again, it's not rewriting or reinventing the wheel. It's just adding those natural enhancements to what you've already done. But it's just started to bring everything out a little bit more overall energy, just to give it a little bit more excitement, really.
One question overall about this mix. So I think like, maybe not as much as the classical master that you did that you were talking about, but still like the dynamic range on this song is pretty drastic, like from the beginning being like very kind of quiet to then like building to a first kind of climax and then building to that second climax. So do you have do you have kind of more or less a rule of thumb for? I'm assuming no, because you don't seem to have a lot of rules of thumb, which is really great. But yeah, how do you decide, like, okay, the dynamic range, I need to squash it a bit, but not too much? Like, where do you decide that line is for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I think the overall thing is I don't want to keep saying balance, but balance is probably right. But if you just, I know they say don't mix and master with your eyes, but sometimes it's a useful tool. So I can see, for example, we can tell there's a lot of dynamics just in the waveform, and just even in the intro there, I can see there's a natural build-up going into this kind of, I don't want to call it a versy area, but it is a versy area, and you can see here where the drums kick in. See, now there's a natural tendency. You can see here, this is a louder element part of the song, this is a louder part of the song. We can see that this is more dynamic than this part because we know we've got all the craziness in this part. It's just about using your ears and experience, really. And this is where I knew that there were certain elements that were, the snare, for example, is probably the biggest peak in this particular area. I don't really want to kind of affect that too much, which is why I didn't want to start to apply any overall mastering compression or stereo compression, or what do they call it, single band compression. I didn't really want to kind of go down that route because I wanted to retain a lot of that, because in this area I think it adds to that natural energy, and it was certainly an intentional part of the song. So a lot of it is just listening to the material you've got and highlighting if there's a particular place where you feel it needs to be compressed more than somewhere else. And in this case, I didn't really feel that. It's probably just a little bit more experience over time, but going with your natural instincts about the songs and what you think the artist's intent might be. We know that this is a little bit more compressed here because we can tell by the waveform. It's less dynamic and it is more compressed, but that's because it's going crazy. So, you know, I think a lot of it is more around feel, and it's with your intent. And I think I mentioned this earlier on about saying being intentional. Listen to the song, and with this particular song, it's an emotional song, and I've said this many times before. It's got that emotion to it. So you don't want to take it that way, and the easiest way to take that way would be through over compressing. So I'll allow the song to breathe. I'll allow the louder parts, and I'll allow the more mellow parts. And this is hopefully will come on to something that's going to be interesting in a second, which might also help answer this question.
One thing that I find interesting is that when you are mixing, you don't see this unless you render when you're mixing just to see the waveform, but I don't think that many people do that. And you are completely right. When you see the waveform, you see the shape of the structure of the song. And I love using eyes. I think they're great. So when they say mix with your ears, I always like to think, and your eyes, why not? So
yeah, they're there for a reason, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you'd rather have something like this where you can say, okay, well, you can certainly see where the undulations are in the actual track rather than this great big fat compressed sausage, wouldn't you? That sounds just like, you know. So, yeah, I think use all the tools that are available to you. But there is one slight other thing I wanted to show you here. Now, I'm going to go into this probably a little bit more in depth in a second if you're happy with us too. But I didn't really do much automation here, except for the crescendo. And it's just a tool that's often underused, but it's something that can be so beneficial. And literally we're talking a dB. And this is the reason why I've got the limiter on the master. So we can use the automation on the track itself, and we know that we're going to use the limiter on the master, so it's not going to start clipping. I think this is the bypass there, isn't it? Yeah, bypass removes FM2.
So you're talking about this automation is coming after the effects on the track, but before the effects on the master, naturally.
Yes, yes. And I think I'm sure there's ways of manipulating it. I don't know how, because there's so many different ways of doing pre, post, and all sorts of things in Reaper. But I tried, because one of the things I wanted to do earlier on is when I show the alternative in a second, is ideally I wanted to have the limiter on the individual track. One of the things I noticed that if I put the limiter on the individual track, it would still clip the master. So obviously it's coming, the automation comes post effects on the individual track, and then you need the limiter on the master to counteract that. But it's literally just this little element here, just a bit of automation. It's so subtle, which adds that more energy in that particular area. was bypass. Let's quickly just engage that and try again. And it's just a way of using the just simple volume automation to add certain energy in certain areas. And it was something I didn't really kind of do too much of in the original. And you asked me what I would do as an alternative. Would I do something differently? Automation would be where I would do things differently.
Interesting. Yeah, it's especially like where the boost is happening. It just makes that that crescendo on the toms kind of more pronounced as well. And then you land into kind of like the peak area.
Exactly.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming if you are, say, mastering an album, then it becomes a lot more important. Right? Like if you say you got like an interlude after a song that's just much quieter, would you in that case actually like adjust the limiter, or would you just do some volume automation to like kind of bring it close?
Either. I mean, you could do. There's so many different ways to do it, and it all depends on. I suppose if you're doing an interlude, once again, you'll probably have to start getting into a little bit more of take effects and things like that, and you can look at maybe something like that and actually process that slightly separately. But there are so many different ways of doing it. Automation for me is just a bit of a classic one because it's just some simple little volume moves that can just create those little differences between different parts of the song. But yeah, you can do all sorts of different things. It depends on whether with Reaper you could master it all in one track, you could master it all in individual tracks and just have it sequenced. It depends on how the overall intention of the album really. But if you've got like an interlude between songs and you want the intention to continue, then yeah, I would probably err on the side of doing it all in one single track, splitting it up maybe in regions, and then maybe look at some form of take effects and things like that, or volume automate between the individual songs themselves.
That is very cool to see. And I mean, I'm happy that when I said, would you do anything differently, you wouldn't be like, oh yeah, everything.
No. Well, this is something that I actually showed us a little while ago. And it was something, because this is probably a perfect example of where to show it off. And this is where automation, you can really get creative with the automation. This is what I've done on this one here. And it looks quite drastic, but it's only because I've actually just increased the size. But we're literally talking like plus 0.4 to 0. And then, it's maintaining, building plus 0.4. And it's these little additional volume swells going back into that crescendo. And this is something that, it's something that I would certainly do again. Do you want to just play? Should I just play this little section here?
Sure, yeah.
I'll play this section here. And then I'll just leave it in, I won't bypass it and engage it because you probably won't get the full effect. But this is where you can start to really listen for the elements of the song and just play with the creative elements of the automation.
I really like that, yeah.
You got to build.
Yeah, it makes a huge. It kind of like primes the listener, right? So that you're kind of like, okay, and then again it goes up. It makes it so much more effective, I think.
Yeah, and it's not doing it's the creative element, but it's working with what you've got. For example, this part right here, and it's literally just going from plus point 0.4 down to 0, but it's just it's just enhancing that swell right at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Simple things like that, and just little builds like here when we get into the I think it was around about here that the bass drone comes in, and it's maintaining volume, roll off, build the crescendo back in, and even this little bit when you went really crazy at the end, just give that another little bump around there, just kind of just take it up a little edge and enhance the roll off as well. So that's probably something that I think that that I probably would have done differently. Really start to look at the automation aspects as well.
Very nice. Somebody asked a while ago, and we just moved on to this. So I'm just gonna do that one leftover question, and that is, what kind of converter do you recommend for like a small home studio? Do you have any preferences there? Audient, okay.
Yeah, the reason why I say that is because the outputs are basically flat. It's probably the best bang for the buck, and it's probably from the actual technical standpoint, it's probably I think it's the best value for money and the highest quality. I don't know what converters are actually in there, but if you look at it's not just so much about the converters, it's also about the total sum of all the parts. And if you're looking for an interface, then you really also want to look at things like the output and any frequency response of the output, because if you've got a flat frequency on the output, then you're going to get a much better result than something that's going to be rolling off the lows. You're going to lose a lot of the low end, or rolling off the highs, and you're going to lose a lot of the high end as well. So if you get something that's got a flat frequency response, then that's something you want to be looking for. The Audient would probably be my recommendation. I did have the Antelope Audio Zengo Synergy Core for a while. That was great, but then that developed a ground fault, which was just a nightmare. It just made buzzing noises for the monitors. So I can't recommend that on the pure basis that the one I had was, it went kaput after about a month. But the Audient stuff I think is really solid, certainly for the money. RME, if you've got the money, something like that. If you've got a little bit more money, RME, then you start getting into the really crazy stuff.
Who's that? I always forget this guy's name. He compares audio interfaces.
Julian
yes,
Krause.
Julian Krause. Yeah.
Very good.
Good stuff.
He's probably, because he does a lot of his charts, and I once again, it was a lot of the stuff that he was doing that got me into some of the bits that I'd bought. Because the Motus, you got the M2, is it the M4?
I have the M2, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that as well has been one that's been right up there, that has been really highly regarded for it's been out for a couple of years now, hasn't it? But the new audience stuff just seems the Mark IIs just seems to have gone to a new level. They've really taken it to that next step. So I'd say anything like that as the audience stuff for the mastering. But we was talking about this because there is still a lot of snobbery in the mastering realm. Let's say the mastering domain. Oh, you can't master if you haven't got $5,000 worth of converters, and you haven't got let's say 150 grand's worth of outboard gear. In most environments, unless you've got your acoustics in place right, you're not going to notice the difference. You are not going to notice the difference. So in terms of your priorities, if you're looking to really start to get serious about the mastering, then think about your environment first, think about your monitoring. Once all that's in a real good shape, then you can start thinking about your converters, because you won't get the benefit from them until the rest of the stuff's in place.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, for sure. And I guess, so this I could have asked at the beginning, but you were mentioning that you're going to do kind of like some 101 stuff.
Yeah.
I think one thing that a lot of people say And to me, it sounds kind of incorrect. You know, it's kind of similar to like people say, oh, start with an acoustic guitar, then buy an electric. I think that's garbage. And similarly, a lot of people seem to believe that you got to get to a certain stage as like a mixing engineer, and then you can get into mastering, as if one is like the step up that you have to take. Do you agree with this? Or do you think, I mean, I agree that a mastering engineer needs kind of like the technical know-how, a little more of a developed ear, definitely a better space, but what is like a stage at a person's life where they can kind of take your 101 course, let's say, and then kind of work from there? What's the prerequisite?
I mean, there's two trains to thought, and once again, it kind of goes back to this. Mastering itself is a completely different mindset than mixing. Now, it's interesting because I started to do mixing, and I still do some mixing, and I really focus on the mastering. But what I've found is, since really focusing on the mastering, it's helped me mix better, and it's kind of it just really focuses you to listen in certain areas. Now, do I think that you have to be a grade A? I'm not necessarily sure you have to know how to mix as such. I think you just have to have a really good ear for the mastering. Is probably ear is going to be is the biggest thing, and it's trying to highlight and really hone in on certain areas that either you can enhance or guide the mix engineer to enhance as well. Do I think that you need to have a background in mixing? It will certainly help, but I think also with mastering, I would recommend people to completely treat it as a totally separate process. You know, this is why I would always recommend, don't just stick things on the master bus of your mix. Do a completely fresh new session. Don't even do it the same day. Come back at it at a different time. And it's not for any other reason than just come at it with a clear head. You need to be really clinical and have a real clear plan of what it is you want to do. So it's a complete different mindset to that of a mixing engineer. I think having some kind of skills as a mixing engineer will certainly help. Certainly understanding the basics of compression, EQ, that kind of thing. But the critical thing for me is when it comes to mastering is you got to be clear with your intent as to what you want to do and really focusing on what it is you hear over the entire stereo file and the entire stereo field. Basically, you don't necessarily you can get so lost in the weeds when it comes to mixing, and that's why I think it's so much a separate process and should be treated as such. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have an opinion either way. I think you can probably do it both ways. Certainly having mixing skills will help, but I think you do really need to come at it from a completely fresh approach.
And for someone who is picking up these skills and considering a career in mastering, how do you think that people should go about finding the clients and really becoming a professional?
Yeah, it really is a great question. And I think it's one of those things where it's a really difficult thing to answer, a really difficult question to answer. Because it's like, well, how do you get clients? And it's kind of, you've got to start to think of, well, how do you build a portfolio? Because you've really got to start to showcase your skills. So how can you actually do that in a way when you haven't got any clients? So I'd start by recommending maybe people look at something like Produce Like a Pro Academy or something like that. I mean, they do focus more on mixing, but if it's something like that, you can start to build up some mixing chops and then maybe look at doing your masters and build a portfolio that way. Do some stuff for friends, get to know some local bands. The likelihood is you may need to start doing a few little bits for free until you can build up your portfolio and start to advertise your services or do some at some discounted rates. I don't. It's one of those tricky ones. Don't undersell yourself. Don't start doing this Fiverr thing for $5 a master, that kind of thing. Because it's, how long is it? Even if you think it's going to take, it might take you 2 hours, 3 hours to master your first track. What's the minimum wage in the UK? Depends on how old you are, but let's say it's, say it's £8.50 an hour. Well, that's what 25 quid for 3 hours worth of work. Don't go on Fiverr, sell 3 hours worth of work for £5. It's I know you've got to build a bit of a name for yourself and you've got to build a bit of a portfolio, but you've also got to think about your own time, your own skills, and what it is you are worth. So it is a real difficult question. I think it is kind of like get to start knowing some local bands, work with some local artists, see if you've got any friends that have got bands, see if you can do some stuff for them. Maybe reach out to some other engineers or some other artists and just say, can I, maybe do a master for my portfolio or show off? One of the things I've actually done is for a video coming up very soon is through the Cambridge Music Technology website. The artist, is it the Black Crown?
Yeah, I did. I mixed that song on one of my streams too. Yeah.
Well, because they've released their final mix for mastering practice, and I really wanted to. I thought it's just something that people can do. They can also try themselves, and take some of the techniques away. So I reached out to the band, and they said, "Yeah, of course. Just let us know when you've done the video, and then they'll make sure that they do their bit their end on the distribution things, so it doesn't come back as a copyright strike on YouTube." It's just things like that. Just thinking a little bit outside the box. Reach out to some people and just say, "Look, I want to do certain. I want to build my portfolio, and this is what I'm looking to do," and just try that really.
How did it work for you? How did you get there?
For me, well, it was a lot of it was basically doing that. Speaking to different clients, speaking to different people, offering to do certain bits for favours and things like that. One of my probably one of my most popular clients was just one I did just as a favour. He was really kind of struggling with some cash, and he said, I can't afford to pay us, so don't worry, I'll do it as a favour for you. And he's been one of my most regular clients now, comes back, pays all the time and things like that. And it's just, you've got to start to get a foot in, build your portfolio somehow, just doing some bits for free, just seeing if you can borrow some music from somewhere and you can use it as part of your portfolio, and then just start to get your word out there, get people to know more about you. YouTube's been quite good for me as well. It was part and parcel of doing it, just kind of get some of my my knowledge and skills out there so people can see what it's like. I think that when it comes to hiring an engineer, and especially when it comes to charging someone for your services, they will need to know that you've got a certain skill level. So that's probably the biggest thing, is how can you demonstrate your skill level. So it's just do whatever you can to build your portfolio and work at it over time, so you can demonstrate that you are worth what it is you want to charge over time, basically.
And you have started working from home, or have you started working in a studio and then transitioned?
No, so basically it's always been from home, and it's kind of I've started with different setups and just built it up over time, really, because a lot of it is going to be building knowledge, and especially when it comes to things like acoustic treatment, and that's a real minefield. Knowing what equipment to buy, knowing what you need, the level of equipment you need, even things like DAWs, and knowing what DAWs do, what some don't do. It can take literally just so much time just to build up that basic knowledge. And it was kind of one of those things that I've always wanted to do, is kind of do it from a home environment and really kind of set up a whole project. And it's just taking it bit by bit, really. Every day there's something new that kind of comes along, something else you have to do, something else from a business perspective you have to learn, and that's probably half the battle, is actually running a business as well as actually doing the engineering side as well. And that, it's something I've always wanted to do and build my own environment. Will I go and get a dedicated studio at some point? Probably, most likely, because it is a small environment here. And like you say, as the way that technology moves on, and things like spatial audio, Dolby Atmos and things like that, I will have to at some point upgrade to a nice bigger space. But it's nice. I get to be close to the family. I get to do what I love doing, and I get to be annoyed by the kids whenever they want to, really.
One note that I would add to what you said about Fiverr and stuff, I think it's better to work for free than to work for cheap, because if you master for 25 quid and you want to go up to 100, it's hard to justify a 400% price increase. Whereas if you do stuff for free, it's clear that it's a favor. It's clear that it's not going to be like that forever, and then you just set your price. Whereas, it's just really hard to, at one point, be known as a 25 quid a master person, and then suddenly go up to 100. It's I think it's it's the art, isn't it, of trying to
trying to not sell yourself short, but also make sure you get something off the back of it as well. Not just say do something for free. You do something for free as long as you have the agreement that you can use that for your portfolio. That is your payment. That is your payment to build that portfolio, because that is going to be the biggest thing you have is your portfolio. If other clients want to come and see what you can do or listen to what you can do, if you haven't got a portfolio, then it's just a website, isn't it, or a Facebook page. So until you've got that, that is going to be crucial. So do whatever you can, but that is your form of payment, and treat that as a form of payment. So you're not just doing things for free and not getting anything off the back of it.
Right, absolutely.
I have another question. So you mentioned that a master may take a beginner 3 hours to do, but on this one, we have been talking about this master for the better part of 2 hours at this point, but how long did it take you to actually get there?
I don't recall. I mean, it all depends. With something like this, probably about, I don't know, maybe about an hour and 20, something like that. An hour is probably a rough estimate, a good rough estimate for a song. It really depends on what it needs. It's like with this, you could be much more delicate with it. It's when you know some of the quicker ones is when you know, okay, well, I need to do this. I need to add some overall compression. Maybe there's just a little bit more low end that needs. Maybe we can tame the highs, and they're relatively with those ones that they can be quite straightforward, and we can take, you know, maybe 45 minutes or something like that. It's with these ones where you can really get into the nitty gritty of the song. You know that there's a bit more energy. You know you can start to just embellish certain areas. This probably took about an hour and 20, something along those kind of lines. But it does vary. It really does. But I'd say probably about an hour is probably a good rule of thumb.
Fair enough. It takes longer to explain than to actually do.
It does, yeah, especially when you got me going off on tangents. Talking about loudness and things like that.
Well, one thing that we thought would be fun to do, but perhaps maybe not to do it today because this is already a long stream, but maybe we can do a sequel to this, because we thought it would be cool if you take then one of Leandro's mixes that you've never heard, or maybe you've heard it once on a stream or something, and then do a master, and we'll just sit quietly and basically watch you do it. That would be something fun if you're down to do that maybe another time.
Yeah. Yep. Sounds great to me.
Just going off a follow-up on what Leandro asked. So let's say like about an hour for a song. So if you're doing an album and it's 10 tracks, would you actually then spend 10 hours on it? Or because it's an album, there are things that kind of that every track shares, and do you also have like a cutoff where you go like, I won't spend more than say 6 hours on a thing because then my ears are going to be unreliable? Do you have things like that?
Yeah, well, kind of, yeah. I mean, obviously, ear fatigue is probably the crucial one there. I wouldn't necessarily do a 10 hours straight, break it up into chunks, because I think that's probably sometimes when I get my best results is when I take a break and come back and listen to it after a little while, because you come back at it fresh and you think you was heading in the right direction, and you come back and listen to it fresh and think, oh, actually, no, what if I took it here? And you think, oh, I actually prefer that slightly better. So taking regular breaks is going to be the kind of thing. There are certain things that you can do, especially if you're thinking of an album, you want it to be cohesive, so you know the rough kind of sound that you want to get. But it depends on how eclectic the album is, and I suppose that's always going to be one of the challenges. But if you've got like a straightforward rock and roll album where they sound very similar, if you know that you've got certain instrumentation in place and they're using the same instruments, same vocalist, you kind of know what to look for. The first song will probably take you the longest. Then after that, there's a bit of a roll-on effect where it will take a little bit less over time. It's the other bits as well that you don't really seem to consider. You know, if there are needs for things like metadata, bits and bobs like that can take up some time. But it just depends on the projects. But once again, if you get something that comes along and it sounds all the tracks sound relatively the same, then they can be more straightforward after the first one or two tracks.
Very cool.
Do you mostly work on singles, full albums, or a good mix of both?
Mix of both, really. Yeah, because a lot of this stuff I do is more independent, then you do get a mix of both. I probably tend to see more EPs than albums. that kind of thing, because it's the way that the independent artists, they're not going to start doing necessarily 14, 15 album projects, but it's a bit of everything really.
And do you get mixes that are mostly done by the artists themselves because they are independent, or do you work with stuff that was created by professional mixers?
Both really. It can be a lot of the stuff I will see from mixed by independent artists, but I do get some other stuff as well that comes through that's been professionally mixed by an independent mix engineer. It really is just a bit of a mixture. I think where I don't want to get into make this a controversial subject. It really depends. It also depends on what the mix engineer tells the client, and whether they tell the client that the best for their song is to have an independent mastering engineer. A lot of mix engineers won't. They'll just want to master it themselves, which for me, I do find that that's not going to give probably the best result for the client, because you do lose that objectivity. So you don't necessarily see too much stuff coming in from the independent stuff that's necessarily been mixed and then come through to a separate mastering engineer. But it does happen. I've had quite a few projects like that, but they are probably more stuff where the independent artist says, "Oh, I've mixed this. This is where I've got it to," or someone from the band who's who's a bit more of a bit more clued on with the production side and the mixing side. They will take responsibility, then it will come through, and then we'll work with them to master it. But it is a bit of a mixed bag.
And do you work alone, or do you have assistants doing the metadata and these other parts of the?
I wish.
The process.
I wish. No, it's all metadata is one of those. It's once again, it's another bit that's kind of a bit dying out a little bit, because it's one of those things where we think we've got to do all the metadata, but when you start uploading it to things like CDB, Baby DistroKid, they will ignore the metadata anyway. So when you come to upload it through digital platforms, they will say that you have to do the metadata when you upload the tracks, and it's at that point that any metadata you add will be added to the track. So sometimes metadata is a little bit it's a bit like CDs to a certain degree. It is dying off a little bit.
Yeah, I learned that the hard way when I did the metadata for like the whole album, and then DistroKid just gives you like a million text fields and there's no like bulk input of anything. You just do it one by one.
Yeah, I mean,
it was very annoying.
I can see why, and it probably actually makes perfect sense, because they're going to be the ones that get the ISRC codes for you, aren't they? So from that perspective, I can see why it makes total sense. But yeah, it can be a bit frustrating when you've sat there and you've done all the metadata and you suddenly realise, I didn't need to do that, did I? It's all the digital upload.
Right.
Oh, Christ.
Yeah.
It would be nice of them to lift that metadata from the files.
Like at least give you the option, right? Like, so if you've done it, you don't have to do it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be better for the artist, but obviously, yeah, that's down to the distributors, unfortunately.
Do you make any of your own music, by the way? Do you do that kind of on the side, either as a hobby or is it something you do?
Yeah, well, I'm a guitarist. I've loved playing guitar for over 20 years now. And I love noodling around with different bits. I've got so many unfinished songs that it's unbelievable. But for me, the passion was always engineering. So once I got into the engineering side, having got into recording guitars and things like that, that was basically dipping my toe into the engineering side. I got the bug, and it's kind of just it's snowballed on from there. But yeah, I love playing guitar. Play guitar, a little bit of bass. I sing badly. I don't play. I can play a little bit of drums, but not very well. But it's I just like creating some little bits and bobs here and there. Some different, sometimes it might be a little bit more metal, sometimes it might be a bit more punky, a bit more hard rock and stuff like that. But yeah, I love playing guitar.
Nice. I guess, is there anything? Have you been sent stuff where you're like, nah, I don't want to do this? Like, you know what I mean? Things that you're just like, it's not me. Like, I won't be able to do it justice, or.
I haven't yet, but I'm sure there will be, because I think it's one of those things you got to keep the passion. And if you're not passionate about the project, it's, are you going to give it your best? Are you really going to be able to give it your best work? Probably not. But it's not really been something that's come through so far that I've thought, this isn't really for me. But I'm sure in time that will come. But there have been a few times when someone's maybe doing something that's maybe controversial, maybe the song is about a controversial topic, that kind of thing that I'm just not going to get involved in. But for the actual song itself as an entire piece, unless it's something really controversial, then I'll always have a look at it, look to see if there's something that I feel that I can enhance it with. And as I say, I can't think of any except for those where they've been just like when I've been talking about killing people and stuff like that, and that doesn't I'm not interested in that. But other than that, I think most of the other stuff that's come through I've always been able to do something with.
Speaking of controversy, I have another question for you, especially because you are working with some material that was mixed by the artists themselves. Do you always work with a stereo file, or do you sometimes ask for the stems for some tracks and then get into some of the mixing as well?
Predominantly stereo files, and then we'll basically, if I feel that I can't do what I need to do with the stereo file, I'll go back to the client. If they're mixing it, I'll ask them to make some revisions. But if they don't know exactly what it is, because there have been times when they've said, well, I'm not really sure what it is I need to do, then I'll say, okay, well, send me some files. We'll have a look at the stems and then maybe do a little bit of stem mastering and go down that route. But generally it'll be a stereo file, or jump on a video call with them and just actually guide them through the process and say, well, this is, if you was to do this in the mix, then maybe this is how we can start to get a better result and do it that way. I'm not a massive, I don't want to say a non-believer in stem mastering. It has its place, but it's not something that I particularly, that I would do. But there have been occasions when I've either done something for a client or jumped on a call with them and guide them through the process. And then we've done it that way.
Yeah, stem mastering is a controversial topic for sure.
Yeah, it is, but I suppose it's kind of like, I don't know, anyone who has some familiarities with Dolby Atmos mastering, you've got to do stem mastering. There is no alternative. So it's kind of like for spatial audio and Dolby, then you have to work on stems. So it has been controversial. Probably it will turn less controversial as things move forward, I would say.
Yeah, like the role of mastering engineers has changed kind of throughout the years. It goes even through cycles a little bit, I feel like. And yeah, so stem mastering, who knows it's going to be. But you're right, with Atmos, it's just the way to go, because that's what they're getting you for. Yeah,
and I think it's once people become more familiar with working that way, then I don't know if it will become the norm, but certainly it will probably become a little bit more familiar where people will be more open to doing it. I mean, I don't have an aversion to doing stem mastering, but there is a fine line between, like you say, do you spend an hour and a half on a master, or do you then take that one track into 3-4 hours stem mastering? You've got to have a conversation at that point of your rates and things like that. Is am I going to work for a stereo file rate when I'm doing a stem master? Probably not. So is it then in the client's interest to do that? I don't know. That's the conversation you've really got to have.
Do you usually charge per project or per hour?
I normally charge per project. Certainly that's the way I look at it, because I think there's things that I can control. I can pretty much control when I do things, and that's the flexibility I've got. And there is, I can understand people charging by the hour, but sometimes, like you say, sometimes there are cases where if I'm in that particular environment where I'm not particularly feeling, let's say I'm not particularly feeling creative, I don't want to start and stop a session. Sometimes it might just be worth actually say, well, today, I can't really get into it, let's take a break. And I wouldn't feel comfortable charging someone an hour if I knew that it was something to do with me, where I didn't feel that I could kind of deliver on that basis. So for me, it's kind of like, work with the client, be open with the client, I charge a flat rate and say, well, this is my rate to master a song. And then you can be more flexible. You obviously got working deadlines, but you can work around when you're feeling most creative. That's the way I think about it. But, it's not, it's not everyone's...
What's your revision structure with that? So you have like a fixed rate, and then is it like past a certain number of revisions, then you would charge a little extra for that?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I suppose for me, it's always kind of like any revisions. I always ask for people to do it within a month. So I think this is the thing where I've got no real concerns with doing multiple revisions. I mean, not that I don't really have an experience of someone coming back and needing 3, 4, 5 revisions. Normally it's done within maybe a couple of revisions, if that. But it's yeah, you could charge more for it, but for me, if I've got to start doing 4 or 5 revisions, then for me, I haven't done my job properly in the first place, in terms of I haven't understood the client's needs. So I'm always quite relaxed in terms of that. If I need to do more revisions, then I'll do more revisions. But for me, there's always a cut-off after a month. If a client comes back after, say, a month and a half, 2 months, well, I want you to make some tweaks. Well, then you've got to pay me again. But if they come back within, a few days, a week, or something like that, and say, well, because that's what it's about. It's about working with the clients to get the end result. And if they're coming back after 2-3 months saying, well, I want you to make some tweaks, it's like, well, no, we could have done this within a week, 2 weeks, or something like that. I'm always willing to work with someone to get the best sound, but it works both ways. We've got to be kind of open and honest with each other, and not just coming back because, for whatever reason, after 3 months they've decided that they want a slight tweak.
And that happens, yeah, for sure. People like grow a little bit, like maybe even their ears kind of gets better or something, and then they will come back.
And when trends change and there's new sounds that come out, and fashions change, and it could be someone comes back after 6 months. Well, I know that was the kind of sound that it was then, but I don't want it like that now. I want it to follow. Well, okay, well you're basically looking for a new master. So then we need to look for a new project. So, I'm relatively flexible with things like that. I've always said that I'm not happy. I think I said it to you in your email when I've done this. I'm not happy unless you're happy, and that's the kind of philosophy. It's a team game, isn't it? That's the way I look at it. It's not me. This is the sound that I'm looking for. This is the sound that I think that the client wants from the information I've got from the client, and that's the key. The communication with the client is the key. If you can get all of that information, you know what they're looking for. It makes the mastering relatively straightforward, because you know what kind of sound, you know what they kind of what makes them tick, you know what they like, and it should make things much more straightforward after that.
I guess one more question too that I had, other than like mid-side processing, do you ever play with things like, I don't know, like delaying the side channel, or getting into kind of correcting the stereo image of a mix, like a mix is too wide or it's too narrow, things like that?
Sometimes, but it's a difficult one, because I don't like stereo widening plugins, for example, because stereo widening plugins, the way that they do things, you lose a lot of those mono frequencies as well. It really is kind of pushing things, and you can really overdo it very quickly. There are different techniques you can use, maybe some mid-side and the highs and things like that. Look at the high frequencies to give that impression of width. I'm not against things like that, but I have to be very much strategic. And that's the thing with all of this, it's all strategic, the way I would look at things. And I'm not against anything like that, but it's not a general rule of thumb that I'd use on every single master. And what was the first part of the question? That was before the stereo widening. Just as an example, like delaying the side channel, which kind of has that effect as well. No, not really, not anything like that. I mean, there are. In terms of this, one of the things that could be useful, which is probably another topic in its entirety as well, is maybe looking at things like we were talking about this the other day about phase rotation. And this is something where you might, you probably can't see it on the screen, but it says phase aligned. And this is basically just something that's looking at the correlation between the two different parts of the actual waveform itself. So something like that can be quite useful. So if you've got a certain part of the waveform that's off from the center line and it's peaking quite a lot, that can start affecting how your compression reacts and how your limiting reacts and things like that. So sometimes I'll look at things like that, phase rotation, use something like RX or something like that to look at bits and bobs like that. So before you start doing anything else, that I don't want to say your waveform is as good as it can be, but that it's something that's really not going to start affecting your limiter and things like that. But you can be as creative with it as you want, but it is a big element for me. I mean, my ethos is very much working with what you've got and think about the client's intent. You can start, sometimes it's very quickly to go off and veer away from that. So I try to keep very, very simple in that respect.
And
very nice.
Do you ever go for more creative effects like reverbs and different kinds of modulation. Does it have a place in mastering?
Not really. I think that's where, because if you start doing things like that, you are starting to take it away from the artist's intent. I think certainly with modulation and things like that, I would look at once again, volume automation. You can start to play with that, and you can get really creative with elements like that. But I don't really look at things like reverb and parts like that, because that is really altering the sound in a way that is, certainly from my opinion, I think that's taking it too far away from the artist's intent. There may be some times when there might be, there might be a particular need, in a certain situation. So I wouldn't rule it out, but it's not something that I would look at to doing as a general rule of thumb. It's more about working with what you've got to enhance what you can, rather than start to really kind of manipulate the stereo file. Besides, things like that as well, you're starting to do it on the entire stereo track, and that's when it can start sounding very washy very quickly.
I've definitely done like reverbs on like the master track in a mix, like 5%, something subtle like that, and I do kind of like what it does. But I have gone back to some of those projects and just kind of realizing like, okay, like there is a way to do that in a less kind of general sweeping way, and get the same effect,
Yeah, and I think this once again goes back to the whole point around we was talking about earlier on with the EQ side of things. And if you could use a send as such, I suppose, in theory, and you could do EQ the send, so you take off a lot of the low end, or if you don't want a lot of low end rumble from like a reverb as such and stuff like that. But I suppose realistically that is mixing really, But there may be. I'm sure I'll say this will be a case that comes up when someone says, "Oh, what about doing this? Or what about doing that?" And it's like, okay, let's give it a go. I'm not against it, but it's not something I would probably do as a matter of course. I've not done anything like that so far, anyway.
And do you ever go, even in the basics like EQ and compression? Do you ever go like with crazy routing and parallel compression and more sophisticated effects beyond just the basics that we saw?
See, my instinct is to say no, but I'm sure there's been cases where things that spring to mind is like automating certain parameters and things like that. So if you're looking for a certain effect or looking for control in a certain area, I would probably tend to do something more like that. That something like automating a limiter in a certain area, or automate compression in a certain area, or maybe EQ in a certain area. There's so many different ways you can get creative, but it is very subtle. And I think this is the thing, is that the mastering is more around the subtle enhancements rather than wholesale changes. That was the way that I would certainly view it. But yeah, I'm sure there's been times, maybe with some saturation, if you want saturation in a certain area, but it's difficult because you can very quickly overdo things in mastering when you're working on the stereo file. So it's always about balance.
Fair enough.
Okay. Should we call it for today and do a part 2 for mastering a Leandro song? What do y'all think?
Sounds good to me.
Good.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Darren, for joining us. I know you have a brand new 2022 baby, so I know you're very busy. So thanks for making the time.
No worries. Thank you too.
And we'll figure out like when to do the next one, but maybe on a Friday if it works for everybody. My days off will change all the time, so we'll be in touch with that. Any last questions from the chat? I guess throw us that last question. And otherwise, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for preferring this stream to other streams that are going on that I'm going to go check out as well, by Casey, what's his face? Why am I so bad with names? I watch this guy. He does Da Vinci stuff. Yeah. So thanks for preferring our stream to that.
Thank you.
And of course, subscribe to Mastering in a Box. I also know that you do your own live stream, so maybe we'll do a live stream on your channel or something like that. We'll figure all of that out. And yeah, so go subscribe smash that like button, all that stuff. Any last words, Darren, Leandro?
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It is always great to be with you all and meet new people. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I have so many questions because mastering does seem like this magic thing that only the enlightened can do. And when you bring it down to earth and show us the differences that you're making on the track, it really is very instructional. I really appreciated it.
No worries. Thank you. I'm really happy that we've been 2 hours and 45 minutes, and I haven't sworn once, which is always a bonus. And I'll save this for last because I haven't actually told a dad joke yet.
Oh, go on.
So, did you hear about William Shatner and his lingerie company? He's had to disband his lingerie company. It was all to do with branding because apparently Shatner Panties wasn't a good brand name.
I thought it would be going that way.
That's it. I'm done. Oh, that's
Nice.
it. My comical career is over.
Play us out, Leandro.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.